Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time.
It was the summer of 1988 when I first discovered the Whispering Pines Trail. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, and eager to explore the world around me. The trail was about a 30-minute drive from my small apartment in Maplewood, a quaint town nestled in the heart of New England. At the time, I was working my first job as a junior copywriter at a local advertising agency, and the stress of entering the real world was starting to wear on me. The trail became my escape, a place where I could clear my mind and reconnect with nature. Whispering Pines was a hidden gem, relatively unknown to most locals but cherished by those who stumbled upon it. The trail wound its way through dense forests of towering pines, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air was always thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a fragrance that seemed to cleanse my lungs with every breath. In those early days, I would visit the trail 2 or 3 times a week after work. I'd arrive around 5:30 p.m., park my beat-up Honda Civic in the small gravel lot, and set off on the eastern path. This route was longer and more challenging, looping around for about 2 hours before bringing me back to the parking area. I relished the physical exertion, the way my muscles would burn as I climbed steep inclines and navigated rocky terrain. As the weeks passed, I began to notice the subtle changes in the forest. The way the light shifted as summer progressed into fall, the gradual transformation of the underbrush as it prepared for winter. I felt a deep connection to this place, as if the very trees were becoming old friends, silent witnesses to my thoughts and dreams. But there was something else too, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, even in those early carefree days. Sometimes, as I walked deeper into the woods, I'd feel a prickle on the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. I'd turn quickly, half expecting to see someone or something lurking behind a tree. But there was never anything there, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional scurry of a small animal. I brushed these moments off as mere flights of fancy, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies. After all, this was the late 80s, a time before cell phones and GPS tracking. The concept of stranger danger hadn't yet permeated every aspect of our lives. I felt invincible, secure in my youth, and the belief that nothing truly bad could happen to me. How naive I was. How utterly devastatingly wrong. As September approached, I noticed the days growing shorter. The sun began to set earlier, casting long shadows across the trail and turning the familiar landscape into something more sinister. I adjusted my routine, arriving at the parking lot a bit earlier to ensure I'd be back before dark. I wasn't afraid exactly, but there was a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Looking back now, I wonder if some primal part of me sensed what was coming. If there was some ancient instinct trying to warn me, to keep me away from the trail that would change my life forever. But I didn't listen. I couldn't hear the whispers of danger over the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding with excitement as I prepared for what would be my final solo hike on Whispering Pines Trail. I remember that day with crystal clarity, every detail etched into my memory like a scar. It was September 15th, 1988, a date that would come to haunt my nightmares for years to come. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed something out of place, a battered camper van, its once white paint now a dirty yellow streaked with rust and grime. It looked like it had been through hell and back, and its presence sent a chill down my spine. I sat in my car for a long moment, debating whether to continue with my hike or turn back. The rational part of my brain argued that it was probably just another hiker, someone passing through on a long road trip. But there was a deeper, more instinctive part of me that screamed danger. In the end, my stubbornness won out. I refused to let an old van scare me away from my beloved trail. As I stepped out of my car, the air felt different. Heavier, somehow charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant trickle of a stream, seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I locked my car, double-checking the handle out of habit, and set off down the trail. But instead of taking my usual eastern route, I decided to head north. It was a shorter path, one that would loop back to the parking lot in about an hour and a half. I told myself it was because of the fading light, but deep down, I knew it was fear driving my decision. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move of its own accord. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the way the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, the gentle sway of the pine branches in the breeze, but my mind kept returning to that camper van and the sense of foreboding it had awakened in me. Halfway through my hike, as I rounded a bend in the trail, the feeling of being watched intensified. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, certain that I would see someone or something behind me. But the path was empty, the woods silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood there for a long moment, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of another presence. Part of me wanted to call out, to demand that whoever was following me show themselves. But a larger part, the part driven by pure animal instinct, knew that revealing my fear would be a deadly mistake. So I pressed on, my pace quickening with each step. The familiar trail now seemed alien and hostile, every shadow a potential hiding place for unseen threats. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, my imagination conjuring horrific images of what might be lurking just out of sight. As I approached another bend in the trail, the feeling of impending doom became overwhelming. My fight-or-flight response kicked into overdrive, adrenaline flooding my system. Without conscious thought, I ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I crouched there, barely daring to breathe, as the seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the trail, moving slowly, deliberately. From my hiding place, I could see a figure emerge from around the bend. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with an eerie grace that seemed at odds with his size. He paused, his head tilting slightly as if listening for something. And then, to my horror, he turned and looked directly at the bushes where I was hidden. I don't know if he saw me or not, but in that moment I felt the full weight of his malevolent presence. It was like staring into the eyes of a predator, something ancient and cruel that saw me not as a person, but as prey. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity, his gaze never wavering from my hiding spot. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I was certain that the slightest sound would trigger him to attack. Finally, after what must have been only a minute or two but felt like hours, he turned and continued down the trail, his footsteps fading into the distance. I remained frozen in place, my mind racing through possible escape routes. The main road was about 10 minutes away if I ran, cutting through the dense underbrush rather than following the trail. It was risky. I could easily get lost or injured, but it seemed like my only chance. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I burst from my hiding place and ran. I ran like I had never run before, branches whipping at my face and arms, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the undergrowth, his breath coming in ragged gasps that seemed to echo in my ears. By some miracle, I made it to the road. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until I reached the parking lot. The camper van was still there, a silent sentinel in the gathering darkness. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, his face hidden in shadow, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. He didn't move, didn't try to chase me. He just stood there watching, as if he knew this wasn't over. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I reported the incident to the local police and the park rangers, but they found no evidence of the man or the camper van. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted, that it was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had come face to face with true evil that day, had glimpsed a darkness that most people go their whole lives without encountering. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I never hiked alone again after that day. In fact, it was years before I could bring myself to return to Whispering Pines Trail, and even then, only in the company of friends and during the busiest times of day. The forest that had once been my sanctuary became a place of nightmares, its beauty forever tainted by the memory of that terrifying encounter. Now, decades later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, still startled at unexpected sounds. The man from the trail haunts my dreams, a shadowy figure always just out of sight, waiting. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I swear I can hear the whisper of footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, like someone or something biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The days following my terrifying experience on Whispering Pines Trail passed in a blur of sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days. I called in sick to work, unable to face the normalcy of my office job when my entire world had been turned upside down. My apartment, once a cozy refuge, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by passing headlights, sent my heart racing. I spent hours poring over local newspapers and police reports, searching for any mention of similar incidents in the area. To my growing horror, I found a pattern. Over the past decade, there had been a handful of disappearances and unsolved murders in the vicinity of Whispering Pines. The cases were spread out enough that no one had connected them. But now that I was looking, the similarities were chilling. All the victims had been hikers or campers, mostly young men and women in their 20s or early 30s. They had all been alone when they vanished. And in each case, witnesses reported seeing a strange camper van in the area around the time of the disappearances. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I had narrowly escaped becoming another statistic, another missing person flyer tacked up in the ranger station. But why had I been spared when others hadn't? The question gnawed at me, keeping me awake long into the night. A week after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to return to the trail. Not alone, of course. I convinced my best friend Michael to come with me. He thought I was overreacting, that I had let my imagination run wild, but he humored me. We went in the middle of a busy Saturday afternoon, the parking lot full of cars and the trail bustling with families and other hikers. As we walked, I recounted my experience in hushed tones, not wanting to alarm the other hikers. Michael listened patiently, his brow furrowed in concern. When we reached the spot where I had hidden from the man, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The memory was so vivid, so terrifying, that for a moment I was back there, crouched in the underbrush, certain that death was only moments away. "Look," Michael said, pulling me from my thoughts. He was pointing at something on the ground near where I had hidden. At first, I couldn't see what had caught his attention, but as I looked closer, I felt my blood run cold. There, partially hidden by fallen leaves, was a scrap of fabric. It was dirty and weathered, but I could still make out the pattern, a faded floral print that looked like it might have once been part of a dress. Next to it, glinting dully in the afternoon sun, was a small silver locket. With trembling hands, I picked up the locket. It was tarnished and dented, but when I managed to pry it open, I found a tiny photograph inside. A young woman smiled up at me, her eyes bright with life and promise. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, was a name and date, Jenny, 1985. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was evidence, proof that something sinister had been happening in these woods for years. The man I had encountered wasn't just some random drifter or overzealous hiker. He was something far worse. Michael and I reported our find to the rangers and the local police. They seemed skeptical at first, but the locket and the scrap of fabric were enough to warrant a more thorough search of the area. Over the next few weeks, as autumn painted the forest in shades of red and gold, teams of searchers combed through Whispering Pines. They found more evidence, scraps of clothing, a broken watch, even a weathered backpack hidden deep in a ravine. But of the man or his camper van, there was no sign. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echoes of his victim's final moments. The case made headlines in the local papers, and for a while, Whispering Pines became infamous. Hikers stayed away, spooked by the stories of a predator lurking in the woods. The once bustling trail fell silent, save for the whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional cry of a distant bird. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The man, if he was indeed just a man, was still out there somewhere. And something told me that he wasn't done with Whispering Pines, or with me. In the months that followed, I became obsessed with the case. I spent every free moment researching similar incidents across the country, looking for patterns, for anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. I reached out to the families of the missing, offering what little comfort I could, while pressing them for details that might have been overlooked by the official investigation. Some nights, I would wake in a cold sweat, certain that I had heard footsteps outside my window or seen a shadow move across my room. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, bought a security system that I knew would be useless against the kind of evil I had encountered. But it made me feel better, gave me the illusion of safety in a world that suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers. As winter settled over New England, blanketing the world in white, I found myself drawn back to Whispering Pines, not to hike. I didn't think I'd ever be able to walk those trails alone again, but to watch. I would sit in my car at the edge of the parking lot, a thermos of coffee by my side and a pair of binoculars in my hands, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. I told myself I was being proactive, that I was standing guard to protect others from the fate I had narrowly avoided. But deep down I knew the truth. I was waiting for him to return, because somehow I knew he would. The man from the trail had become my own personal bogeyman, a dark shadow looming over every aspect of my life. And as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of Whispering Pines, he was waiting too, biding his time, planning his next move in a game I didn't fully understand but was now irrevocably part of. The winter passed, and with the coming of spring, a fragile sense of normalcy began to return to my life. The nightmares became less frequent, the constant fear receding to a dull ache in the back. As spring breathed new life into the world around me, I tried to convince myself that the worst was behind me. The police investigation had gone cold. The media frenzy had died down, and Whispering Pines Trail had reopened to the public. Life, it seemed, was moving on, but for me, there was no moving on. The man from the trail had become a constant presence in my life, a dark spectre that haunted my every waking moment. I'd given him a name in my mind, the Whisperer, though I never spoke it aloud. Naming him felt like giving him power, acknowledging his existence in a way that made him even more real. I threw myself into my work at the advertising agency, taking on extra projects and working late into the night. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to exhaust myself so thoroughly that I just might be able to sleep without nightmares. But even in my most busy moments, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It started small at first, a glimpse of a figure in my peripheral vision that would vanish when I turned to look. The sensation of eyes on me as I walked to my car after work. A shadow that seemed to move independently of any light source. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the trauma of my experience had left me hypersensitive to perceived threats. But as the days wore on, the incidents became harder to dismiss. One evening in late April, I was working late at the office. The sun had long since set, and I was alone in the building, the silence broken only by the soft hum of my computer and the occasional rustle of papers. As I reached for my coffee mug, my eyes were drawn to the window behind my desk. There, reflected in the glass, was a face. Not my own, but a face I knew all too well. Broad features, dark eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light, and a smile that was more predatory than friendly. The Whisperer. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But there was no one there. Just the empty office bathed in the sickly glow of fluorescent lights. I gathered my things and left in a rush, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the car door. As I drove home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a battered camper van following me. That night, I dreamed of Whispering Pines. In my dream, I was back on the trail, but everything was wrong. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The air was thick with a foul mist that seemed to whisper as it swirled around me, and there, always just out of sight, was the Whisperer. I could hear his footsteps, smell the musty odor of his unwashed clothes, feel the weight of his gaze on my back. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The trail seemed to loop endlessly, bringing me back to the same spots over and over again. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The sheets tangled around my legs like forest undergrowth trying to hold me in place. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the thought of returning to that office, of seeing that face in the window again. Instead, I spent the day researching. Not just about the disappearances around Whispering Pines, but about similar cases across the country. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were dozens of cases spread out over decades that fit the same pattern. Hikers and campers disappearing from remote trails, strange sightings of a man who seemed to melt into the forest, and always, reports of an old camper van seen in the area. The cases stretched back further than I had imagined, some dating back to the 1950s. How was that possible? The man I had seen couldn't have been more than 40 or 50 years old, unless what I had encountered wasn't a man at all, but something far older, far more sinister. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I had always considered myself a rational person, someone who believed in facts and evidence. But my experience on the trail had shaken that belief to its core. Now I found myself considering possibilities that would have seemed absurd just months ago. Was the Whisperer some kind of immortal being, a predator that had been stalking the forests of America for generations? Or was he something even worse, a malevolent spirit perhaps, that could possess different bodies over time? I shook my head, trying to clear away these thoughts. This was madness. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was a family business, passed down from father to son, a legacy of evil, taught and nurtured over generations. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew in my heart that I was grasping at straws. What I had seen in the forest that day, what I had felt in the presence of the Whisperer, defied rational explanation. As May turned to June, my paranoia reached new heights. I installed security cameras around my apartment, covering every possible angle of approach. I bought a gun, something I had never thought I'd do, and spent hours at the shooting range until I felt comfortable handling it. I started seeing a therapist, hoping that talking about my experience might help me process it. But how could I explain the depth of my fear, the certainty that I was being hunted by something beyond human understanding? In the end, I lied. I told her about a mugging, a random act of violence that had left me shaken. It was easier than trying to make her understand the truth. One night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, unable to sleep, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. But as I strained my ears, it became clearer, whistling, a slow, eerie tune that seemed to float on the night air. It was coming from outside my window. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the whistling grew louder. It was a tune I recognized, though I couldn't place it at first. Then it hit me. It was The Happy Wanderer, an old hiking song I remembered from my childhood. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to call 911. But before I could dial, the whistling stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then so softly I almost thought I had imagined it, I heard a voice. Soon, it said, the words seeming to seep through the walls like poison gas. Soon we'll finish our hike. I bolted upright, fumbling for the light switch. When I finally managed to turn on the lamp, I half expected to see the whisperer standing in my room, that predatory smile on his face. But the room was empty. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my living room, my gun in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, watching the security camera feeds on my laptop. But there was nothing. No sign of intruders, no mysterious figures lurking in the shadows. By the time the sun rose, I had convinced myself that it had all been a dream, a particularly vivid nightmare brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But as I went to make coffee, I noticed something on my front door that made my heart stop. There, scratched into the paint with what must have been a knife or a key, was a crude drawing of a pine tree. And underneath it, 2 words that made my blood run cold. Happy trails. In that moment I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been a dream. The whisperer had been here outside my home. He had found me, and he was ready to finish what he had started on that lonely trail all those months ago. The discovery of the scratched message on my door marked a turning point. No longer could I pretend that the danger was confined to Whispering Pines Trail, or that my encounter had been a one-time thing. The whisperer had brought the hunt to my doorstep, and I knew that I couldn't simply hide and hope he would go away. I called in sick to work again, my voice shaking as I made up an excuse about a bad case of the flu. My boss, concerned about my recent absences and distracted behavior, suggested I take some time off. I accepted gratefully, knowing I would need every moment to prepare for what was coming. My first stop was the local police station. I had been hesitant to involve them again after their skepticism following my initial report, but I no longer had a choice. To my surprise, the detective who had handled my case, a grizzled veteran named Rourke, listened to my story with grave attention. "I believe you, son," he said when I finished, his weathered face creased with concern. "Truth is, we've been keeping an eye on similar reports across the state. Whatever this thing is, it's not just confined to Whispering Pines anymore." Rourke showed me a map dotted with red pins, each representing a disappearance or strange sighting. The pins formed a rough circle, with Whispering Pines at the center. And at the edge of that circle, a new pin marked my apartment. "We think he's expanding his hunting ground," Rourke explained. "But you're the first person we know of who's encountered him and lived to tell about it. That makes you our best chance at catching this bastard." I left the police station with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone finally believed me, that I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. But dread at the realization that I was now bait in a trap for a predator that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I bought camping gear, a new backpack, hiking boots, and enough supplies to last for days in the wilderness. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for, but some instinct told me that this would end where it began, in the deep woods of Whispering Pines. I also reached out to the families of the missing hikers, explaining my situation and asking for any information they might have that could help. Most were skeptical at first, but as I shared details of my own encounter, many opened up. They sent me photos, diary entries, anything that might provide a clue. As I pored over this material, a pattern began to emerge. Many of the victims had reported feeling watched in the days leading up to their disappearances. Some had mentioned strange dreams of being lost in endless woods, and several had drawn or written about a figure they called the Forest Man, a tall, broad-shouldered presence that seemed to blend into the trees. One detail in particular caught my attention. In the journal of Jenny, the young woman whose locket I had found, there was an entry dated just days before she vanished. I saw him again today. The Forest Man. He was standing at the edge of the campground, just watching. When I blinked, he was gone. Am I going crazy? It feels like he's calling to me, like the forest itself wants me to go deeper, to places no one has ever been. I'm scared, but I'm also excited. God, what's wrong with me? Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. I recognized the mix of fear and fascination she described. It was the same feeling that had drawn me back to Whispering Pines, time and time again, even after my terrifying encounter. Was this how the Whisperer lured his victims? By tapping into some primal human instinct, some deep-seated longing for the unknown? As June wore on, the incidents escalated. I would wake to find pine needles scattered across my doorstep, despite there being no pine trees anywhere near my apartment. The whistling returned, always just on the edge of hearing, always playing that same haunting tune. And the dreams? God, the dreams were the worst. Every night I found myself back on that trail. But now, instead of running from the Whisperer, I was following him. He would lead me deeper and deeper into the forest, to places where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sky, where the ground seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. And always, just before I woke up, he would turn to me with that predatory smile and say, "Welcome home." I knew I was running out of time. Whatever game the Whisperer was playing, it was reaching its end game. I had to act, had to confront this thing on my own terms before it was too late. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, I made my decision. I packed my gear, left a detailed note for Detective Rourke explaining my plan, and drove out to Whispering Pines Trail. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the gravel. As I shouldered my pack and checked my gun one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. But I also knew that this might be my only chance to end this nightmare once and for all. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. Then, with a silent prayer to whatever higher power might be listening, I stepped onto the trail and into the deepening shadows of the forest. The hunt had begun, but this time I wasn't the prey. I was the hunter. And somewhere in the depths of Whispering Pines, I knew the Whisperer was waiting for me. The forest seemed to swallow me whole as I ventured deeper into Whispering Pines. The familiar trails I had once walked with such carefree abandon now felt alien and hostile. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking my every move. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I made camp in a small clearing. I had chosen this spot carefully, with clear sightlines in all directions and a large boulder at my back. If the Whisperer came for me in the night, I didn't want to make it easy for him. I ate a cold dinner of energy bars and beef jerky, not daring to light a fire. The darkness closed in around me, the forest coming alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. But underlying it all was a strange silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Sleep was out of the question. I sat with my back against the boulder, my gun in my lap, and waited. Hours passed, marked only by the slow wheeling of the stars overhead and the gradual lightening of the eastern sky. Just before dawn, when the world was caught in that liminal space between night and day, I heard it, whistling, that same eerie tune, the happy wanderer drifting through the trees. I was on my feet in an instant, gun raised, scanning the tree line. The whistling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself was producing the sound. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a voice. It was low and gravelly, with an undercurrent of amusement that made my skin crawl. "Welcome back, little hiker," it said. "I've been waiting for you." I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. And there he was, the Whisperer. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his broad frame silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. In the dim light, I could make out his features, the wide, predatory grin, the dark eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shakier than I would have liked. "What do you want?" The Whisperer's grin widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous for a human mouth. "Oh, I think you know what I want," he said. "The same thing I've always wanted, to finish our hike." He took a step forward and I raised my gun. "Stay back," I warned. "I'll shoot." The Whisperer laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Go ahead," he said. "It won't make a difference. I'm not what you think I am, little hiker. I'm so much more." As he spoke, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shimmer in the air around him. But then I saw it clearly. His form seemed to blur, to shift. One moment, he was the man I had seen on the trail all those months ago. The next, he was something else. Something ancient and terrible, with too many limbs and eyes that burned like coals. I fired, once, twice, 3 times. The gunshots echoed through the forest, startlingly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. But the bullets seemed to pass right through the Whisperer, leaving no mark. He didn't even flinch. "Oh, little hiker," he said, his voice now a multi-toned chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" I backed away, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It defied everything I thought I knew about the world. But there was no denying the reality of what stood before me, a creature that should not exist, that could not exist, and yet undeniably did. The Whisperer advanced, his form continuing to shift and change. One moment he was the man I had first seen on the trail. The next, he was a writhing mass of shadows and teeth. The trees around him seemed to bend away, as if even they feared his touch. "What are you?" I whispered, my back pressed against a tree, nowhere left to run. The creature's laugh echoed through the forest, causing birds to take flight in panic. "I am the forest," it said. "I am the darkness between the trees, the whisper in the wind, the shadow that haunts the edges of your vision. I'm hunger incarnate, little hiker, and you are my prey." As it spoke, tendrils of darkness began to spread from its form, creeping across the forest floor like living shadows. Where they touched, the ground seemed to rot and wither, leaves curling and blackening. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But then, from somewhere deep inside me, a spark of defiance flared to life. I had come here to end this, to stop this creature from hurting anyone else. I couldn't give up now. My eyes snapped open, and I saw the tendrils of darkness mere inches from my feet. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver locket I had found months ago, Jenny's locket. As soon as it touched my skin, it began to glow with a soft, silvery light. The Whisperer hissed, recoiling from the light as if it caused him physical pain. "Where did you get that?" It snarled, all traces of amusement gone from its voice. I held the locket out in front of me like a shield, and the creature's darkness retreated further. "You took her," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You took Jenny and all the others. But you didn't take everything, did you? Some part of them remained, something you couldn't touch." As I spoke, I felt a warmth spreading through me. The locket's glow intensified, and I could have sworn I heard whispers. Not the malevolent hiss of the Whisperer, but softer voices filled with hope and determination. The creature snarled, its form twisting and writhing as if in pain. "You understand nothing," it spat. "I am eternal. I am inevitable. You cannot stop the darkness, little hiker. It will consume you, just as it has consumed countless others before you." But even as it spoke, I could see the fear in its eyes that were now decidedly human, the eldritch horror of its true form fading like mist in sunlight. The Whisperer was weakening, and we both knew it. I took a step forward, then another, the locket held out before me. With each step, the creature retreated, its darkness receding, the malevolent power that had terrorized these woods for so long diminishing. "You're right," I said, my voice steady now. "I don't understand what you are, but I understand this. You feed on fear. You've terrorized and hunted people for God knows how long, growing stronger with each victim. But you're not invincible, and you're not alone." As if in response to my words, the locket's glow spread, enveloping me in a cocoon of soft, silvery light. And in that light I saw them, translucent, shimmering forms of men and women, young and old. The missing hikers, the lost souls of Whispering Pines. They stood with me, their spectral hands reaching out to touch the locket. Adding their light to its glow, the Whisperer howled, a sound of rage and terror that shook the trees and sent animals fleeing in panic. It tried to retreat, to melt back into the shadows of the forest, but the light pursued it, driving it back. "This ends now," I said, my voice joined by the whispers of countless others. "You will never hurt anyone again." With a final desperate shriek, the creature that had been the Whisperer seemed to implode, collapsing in on itself like a dying star. There was a moment of absolute silence, a breathless pause in which the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the darkness dissipated. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Whispering Pines for so long lifted, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could truly breathe. The spectral forms around me began to fade, their purpose fulfilled. But before they disappeared entirely, I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. I turned to see Jenny, her form translucent, but her smile as bright as it had been in the photograph. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a breath of wind. "We can rest now." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the clearing as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the canopy above. I sank to my knees, exhausted beyond measure, but filled with a profound sense of peace. The nightmare was over. The Whisperer was gone. As I sat there, watching the sun rise over Whispering Pines, I knew that my life would never be the same. I'd seen things that defied explanation, faced a darkness I never knew existed. But I had also witnessed the power of hope, of memory, of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. I didn't know what the future held, or how I would explain what had happened here to Detective Rourke and the others. But I knew one thing for certain: Whispering Pines was safe now. The trail that had been a source of so much fear and pain could now return to what it was meant to be. A place of beauty, of peace, of connection with nature. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave the clearing, I paused for a moment, looking back at the spot where the Whisperer had made its last stand. There, sprouting from the ground that had been blackened by its touch, was a tiny pine seedling, its needles a vibrant, healthy green. I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Life goes on, I thought. The darkness may come, but the light always follows. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to face our fears, we can be the ones to bring that light into the world. With that thought, I turned and began the long walk back to civilization, leaving behind the horrors of the past and stepping into a future that, for the first time in months, felt full of hope and possibility. The journey back to the trailhead felt surreal. Every step I took seemed to carry me further from the nightmare I had just experienced and closer to a world that suddenly felt alien in its normalcy. The forest, which had been a place of terror for so long, now hummed with life and vitality. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and the sunlight filtering through the leaves created dappled patterns on the forest floor that seemed almost magical. As I emerged from the tree line into the parking lot, I was met with a scene of controlled chaos. Police cars, their lights flashing silently, were parked haphazardly around the lot. A group of officers stood in a tight cluster, their faces grave as they conferred in low voices. And there, leaning against his unmarked car with a look of mingled relief and exasperation, was Detective Rourke. "Jesus, kid," he said as I approached, his gruff voice tinged with concern. "We thought we'd lost you." I must have looked a sight. Clothes torn and dirty, eyes wild, the silver locket still clutched tightly in my hand. Rourke took one look at me and ushered me to his car, waving off the other officers who started to approach with questions. "You can debrief him later," he growled. "Right now, this boy needs rest and about a gallon of coffee." The next few hours passed in a blur. I was taken to the local hospital, checked for injuries. Miraculously, I had nothing more serious than some cuts and bruises, and then escorted to the police station. There, in a small, stuffy interview room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, I tried to explain what had happened in the depths of Whispering Pines. I could see the disbelief in Rourke's eyes as I recounted my encounter with the Whisperer, the creature's transformation, and the supernatural battle that had ensued. But to his credit, he listened without interruption, his weathered face impassive. When I finished, silence fell over the room. Rourke leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Kid," he said finally, "if it was anyone else telling me this story, I'd have them committed. But after what we found out there, I'm inclined to believe you." He pulled a file from his briefcase and spread its contents on the table between us. Photos, reports, and hand-drawn sketches spilled out. "While you were in the woods, we did some digging. Turns out the disappearances around Whispering Pines go back a lot further than we thought. We're talking centuries." I leaned forward, my exhaustion forgotten as I pored over the documents. There were newspaper clippings dating back to the early 1800s. All reporting on mysterious disappearances in the area. Sketches from various time periods depicted a figure eerily similar to the Whisperer, always lurking at the edge of the frame, half hidden by trees. "Whatever that thing was," Rourke continued, "it's been haunting these woods for a long, long time. And now, thanks to you, it's gone." I looked up sharply. "You believe me? About what happened?" Rourke sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Son, I've been a cop for 30 years. I've seen things that defy explanation, things that keep me up at night. What happened in those woods? It fits a pattern I've seen before. Sometimes the world is stranger and darker than we want to believe." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "We found this at the site where you said you confronted the creature. Thought you might want to see it." With trembling hands, I unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden figure. It depicted a tall, broad-shouldered man with unnaturally long arms and too many fingers. Its face was a twisted mask of hunger and cruelty. "It's old," Rourke said. "Really old. The lab guys think it might date back to before European settlement. The local Native American tribes have stories about a dark spirit in the woods, a hunger that could never be satisfied. They called it the Wendigo." I ran my fingers over the carving, a chill running down my spine, despite the warmth of the room. "So what happens now?" I asked. Rourke leaned back, his chair creaking. "Officially nothing. We can't exactly put ancient evil forest spirit banished in our report. The case of the missing hikers will remain unsolved, another mystery for the true crime podcasters to chew on." He fixed me with a steady gaze. "Unofficially, you did good, kid, real good. Whatever that thing was, you stopped it. The woods are safe again." As I left the police station that evening, the weight of everything that had happened finally began to sink in. The world felt different now. Larger and more mysterious than I had ever imagined. The comforting certainties of my old life had been shattered, replaced by a newfound awareness of the thin veil that separates our everyday reality from things beyond our understanding. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to adjust to normal life. How do you go back to worrying about deadlines and office politics when you face down an ancient evil? How do you explain to friends and family why you jump at shadows or wake up screaming in the night? I found myself drawn back to Whispering Pines, not out of fear this time, but out of a strange sense of connection. The trail that had been the source of so much terror now felt like a sanctuary. I would spend hours walking the paths, marveling at the beauty I had once been too afraid to see. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when the sun filtered through the leaves just right, I could have sworn I saw them, fleeting glimpses of translucent figures moving among the trees, the lost souls of Whispering Pines, no longer trapped by the Whisperer's dark power, but free to roam the forest they had loved in life. I never told anyone about these sightings, not even Rourke. Some truths I've learned are too profound, too personal to share, but I carry them with me, along with Jenny's locket, which now hangs around my neck as a constant reminder of the battle we fought and the peace we won. As for the Whisperer, or the Wendigo, or whatever it truly was, I don't know if it's gone for good. The world is vast and old, and there are dark corners where ancient evils might still lurk. But I do know this: in the face of darkness, hope and courage can work miracles, and sometimes the light we need to banish the shadows comes from within ourselves. Whispering Pines is safe now, its trails once again filled with hikers and nature lovers. The story of the disappearances has faded into local legend, a spooky tale to tell around campfires. But for those of us who know the truth, who faced the darkness and emerged changed but unbroken, the forest will always hold a special significance. It's a reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, full of wonders and terrors beyond our comprehension. But it's also a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to our capacity for courage and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. As for me, I've found a new purpose in life. I've become something of an expert on local folklore and unexplained phenomena. I work closely with Rourke now, quietly investigating cases that don't quite fit into the usual categories. And if sometimes our investigations lead us into dark places, well, I'm not afraid of the dark anymore. I've seen what hides in the shadows, and I know that with courage, compassion, and a little bit of light, even the deepest darkness can be overcome. The trail that once haunted me has become my path forward. And though the journey may be long and at times frightening, I face it with hope and determination. For I have walked in the valley of the shadow of death, and I have emerged stronger for it. The whispers in the pines no longer fill me with dread. Instead, they remind me of the battles we've fought, the souls we've saved, and the mysteries that still await us in this vast, strange, beautiful world. Months passed, and life settled into a new kind of normal. I had returned to work at the advertising agency, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The world of deadlines and marketing campaigns seemed trivial compared to the vast, shadowy realm I had glimpsed in Whispering Pines. I spent my free time researching, diving deep into folklore and mythology from around the world. The more I learned, the more I realized that the Whisperer, or the Wendigo as Rourke had called it, was just one manifestation of a universal human fear. Every culture had its own version of the monster in the woods, the hunger that could never be satisfied, the darkness that sought to consume the light. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I received an unexpected call from Rourke. "We've got another one," he said without preamble, his voice gruff with fatigue. "Not here, but similar. A small town in Oregon. People going missing in the woods. Sightings of a strange figure. Sound familiar?" My heart raced. "You think it's connected? But we destroyed the Whisperer, didn't we?" Rourke sighed heavily. "I don't know, kid, but I think we need to check it out. You up for a road trip?" I didn't hesitate. Within 24 hours, I had taken a leave of absence from work and was on a plane to Oregon, my backpack filled with notes, talismans, and Jenny's locket. The town of Oak Ridge was a small logging community, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. As Rourke and I drove in, I was struck by how similar it felt to my own hometown. The same sense of isolation, the same uneasy relationship with the surrounding wilderness. We met with the local sheriff, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda Holbrook. She eyed us skeptically as we explained our reason for being there. But the weariness in her eyes spoke volumes about the toll the recent events had taken on her. 3 hikers gone missing in the last month, she said, spreading a map of the area on her desk. No bodies, no trace, just gone like they vanished into thin air. And then there's the sightings. She pulled out a sketchpad, flipping it open to reveal a series of drawings. My blood ran cold. The figure depicted was different from the whisperer I had encountered. But there was an undeniable similarity. The 2 long limbs, the predatory stance, the sense of otherworldly menace. Locals are calling it the Shadow Walker, Sheriff Holbrook explained. Say it moves through the trees like smoke, always just at the edge of vision. Hikers report feeling watched, hearing whispers on the wind. Sound familiar? Rourke and I exchanged glances. More than you know, I said softly. We spent the next few days interviewing witnesses, poring over reports, and hiking the trails where the disappearances had occurred. With each passing hour, my sense of unease grew. There were differences from my experience in Whispering Pines, but the underlying pattern was unmistakable. On our 3rd night in Oak Ridge, I had the dream again. I was back on the trail, but this time it wasn't Whispering Pines. The trees were different, taller and more ancient, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. And there, always just out of sight, was a presence. Not the whisperer, but something similar, something hungry. I woke in a cold sweat, the echo of whispered words still ringing in my ears. The hunger never dies. The next morning I convinced Rourke that we needed to go deeper into the woods. If this is anything like what we faced before, I argued, we need to confront it on its own turf. Rourke looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, kid. But we do this smart. No heroics, no splitting up. We stick together and we stay alert. We set out at dawn, our backpacks laden with supplies, talismans and weapons, both conventional and mystical. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the world seemed to change around us. The colors became muted, the shadows deeper. The usual sounds of forest life, birdsong, rustling leaves, the scurry of small animals, faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. Hours passed, and we found ourselves in a part of the forest that didn't appear on any of our maps. The trees here were enormous, their trunks wider than cars, their canopy so thick it blotted out the sky. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing underwater. We shouldn't be here, Rourke muttered, his hand resting on his gun. This isn't right. I was about to agree when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart pounding, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. And eyes, God, those eyes glowing with a hunger that made the whisperer seem tame by comparison. Rourke, I whispered, my voice shaking, we're not alone. What happened next was a blur of terror and confusion. The Shadow Walker, for I knew now that's what we faced, seemed to be everywhere at once. It moved through the trees like living darkness, always just out of reach, its whispers filling our heads with promises of power and threats of unimaginable horror. We ran, our carefully laid plans forgotten in the face of primal fear. Rourke fired his gun, the shots echoing unnaturally in the dense forest, but they seemed to have no effect. I clutched Jenny's locket, its soft glow providing our only light as darkness fell with unnatural speed. And then, just as hope seemed lost, I remembered something from my research. An old Native American legend about a spirit of the forest, not evil like the Wendigo, but a protector, a guardian of balance. With trembling hands, I pulled out the wooden figure Rourke had given me months ago, the carving of the Wendigo we had found in Whispering Pines. Acting on instinct, I pressed it against a massive tree trunk and began to speak, my words a mixture of half-remembered native chants and my own desperate pleas. Guardian of the forest, I called out, my voice growing stronger. Protector of life, we seek your aid. Balance has been disturbed, darkness threatens to consume all. We offer this token, this symbol of defeated evil, and ask for your intervention." For a moment, nothing happened. The Shadow Walker's whispers grew louder, more insistent. Rourke swore, firing his last bullet into the darkness, and then, miraculously, the forest came alive. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Roots burst from the earth, writhing like serpents. The trees themselves seemed to move, their branches reaching out to form a protective barrier around us. And there, emerging from the trunk of the ancient tree where I had placed the carving, was a figure of light. It was hard to look at directly, its form shifting and changing like sunlight through leaves. But I could make out the general shape, tall, majestic, with a crown of antlers and eyes that held the wisdom of millennia. The guardian, for I knew that's what it must be, raised a hand, and the forest fell silent. The darkness that had been encroaching on us recoiled, and I heard a scream of rage and frustration that could only have come from the Shadow Walker. What followed was a battle unlike anything I had ever seen or could have imagined. Light against darkness, growth against decay, the timeless balance of nature against a hunger that sought to consume everything in its path. Rourke and I could only watch in awe as forces beyond our comprehension clashed around us. In the end, it was over as suddenly as it had begun. The Guardian turned to us, its form already beginning to fade back into the forest. "The balance is restored," it said, its voice like the rustling of leaves and the flow of sap. "But beware, guardians of the human realm. The hunger may be defeated here, but it is not destroyed. It will rise again, in other places, in other forms. You must be vigilant." And with that, it was gone, leaving Rourke and me alone in a forest that suddenly seemed alive with the normal sounds of nature. We made our way back to town in a daze, our minds struggling to process what we had witnessed. Sheriff Holbrook was skeptical of our story, but she couldn't deny the results. The disappearances stopped, and the sightings of the Shadow Walker ceased entirely. As Rourke and I prepared to leave Oakridge, I knew that our work was far from over. The Guardian's warning echoed in my mind. The hunger would rise again, and we needed to be ready. "So, kid," Rourke said as we drove away from the town, the forest looming in the rearview mirror. "Where to next?" I looked down at the locket in my hand, then out at the passing landscape. "Wherever the whispers lead us," I replied. "The battle goes on, and we've got work to do." And so we drove on, two unlikely guardians against a darkness most of the world doesn't even know exists. The road ahead was long and fraught with danger, but for the first time since that fateful day in Whispering Pines, I felt truly alive. The hunger may never die, but neither will the light that stands against it. And as long as there are those willing to face the darkness, there will always be hope. Years have passed since that day in the Oregon woods, and my life has become a journey I could never have imagined. Rourke and I have traveled across the country, chasing whispers and shadows, confronting entities that defy explanation and challenge everything we thought we knew about the world. We've seen things that would drive most people mad, ancient evils awakening in forgotten places, hungry spirits preying on the lost and vulnerable, darkness that threatens to swallow whole communities. But we've also witnessed incredible acts of courage and sacrifice, ordinary people standing up to forces beyond their comprehension, and the enduring power of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Our network has grown. We've connected with others who have glimpsed the truth behind the veil of reality. Folklorists, paranormal investigators, spiritual leaders from various traditions. We share information, pool our resources, and come to each other's aid when the darkness grows too strong for one person to face alone. I've learned so much in these years of hunting. I've delved deep into occult lore, studied ancient texts, and pieced together fragments of forgotten knowledge. I've come to understand that what we face is not a single entity, but a primal force, a hunger that has existed since the dawn of time, taking different forms in different places, but always driven by the same insatiable desire to consume. The Whisperer, the Shadow Walker, The countless other manifestations we've encountered, they're all facets of this greater darkness. And while we can banish them, while we can restore balance to the places they haunt, we can never truly destroy them. The hunger always returns, always finds new ways to manifest. But I've also learned that we are not alone in this fight. There are other forces at work in the world, ancient guardians and protectors that stand against the darkness. We've encountered them in various forms, spirits of nature, ancestral guardians, embodiments of hope and courage. They are not all-powerful, and they cannot fight our battles for us, but they are there, lending their strength when we need it most. As for me, I've changed in ways I'm still trying to understand. The experiences I've had, the things I've seen and done, have left their mark. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the shadows at the edges of the world. But I'm also stronger, more determined. I've faced my deepest fears and come out the other side, and while the nightmares still come, they no longer have the power to paralyze me. Jenny's locket remains my most treasured possession, a reminder of where this all began and of the lives we fight to protect. It's more than just a talisman now. It's a conduit, a link to something greater. In moments of darkness, when all hope seems lost, I can feel the warmth of its glow, hear the whispered encouragement of those we've saved. Rourke, my steadfast companion through all of this, has become more than just a partner. He's a brother in arms, a friend who has seen me at my best and worst. His gruff exterior hides a compassionate heart and an unwavering dedication to our cause. We've saved each other's lives more times than I can count, and there's no one I'd rather have by my side when facing the unknown. Our work is far from over. Even now, as I write this, we're preparing for our next journey. Reports have been coming in from a small coastal town in Maine. Whispers of something stirring in the depths of the ocean, an ancient hunger awakening from centuries of slumber. It's a new challenge, a new manifestation of the darkness we've sworn to fight. I don't know what we'll find there, what horrors we'll have to face. But I do know this. We'll face it together, armed with knowledge, courage, and the unwavering belief that light can always push back the darkness. To those who may read this account, I offer both a warning and a call to action. The world is vaster and stranger than you can imagine, filled with wonders and terrors beyond comprehension. The veil between what you think of as reality and the true nature of existence is thin, and there are things that slip through the cracks, hungry things that seek to devour all that is good and bright in the world. But know this as well, you are stronger than you realize. The human spirit has an incredible capacity for courage, compassion, and resilience. In the face of darkness, be the light. Stand firm against the whispers of fear and despair. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the shadows seem too deep, where hope feels like a distant memory, remember that you are not alone. There are those of us out here standing vigil against the night. We are the watchers in the woods, the guardians at the threshold, the ones who walk the boundary between worlds. And as long as there are those willing to face the darkness, there will always be hope. The hunger may be eternal, but so is the light that stands against it. And in the end, it is not the darkness we must fear, but the choice to look away, to pretend it doesn't exist. Face your fears, stand your ground, and remember, even in the darkest night, stars still shine. Our vigil is endless, our battle eternal. But it is a battle worth fighting for the sake of all that is good and true in this world. And so we go on, into whatever darkness may come, carrying the light of hope with us always. The trail that once haunted me has become my path, leading me into the heart of mysteries, both terrifying and wondrous. And though the journey is long and fraught with danger, I walk it willingly, knowing that each step takes us closer to understanding, to balance, to a world where the whispers in the dark no longer hold power over us. This is my story, my testament. May it serve as both a warning and a beacon of hope to those who come after. The darkness is real, but so is the light within us all. Never forget that, and never stop fighting, for in the end, it is not the strength of our enemies that will determine our fate. but the strength of our own hearts and the bonds we forge with those who stand beside us. The night may be long, but dawn always comes, and we will be there to greet it, guardians of the light, protectors of the balance, forever vigilant against the hunger that never truly dies. This is our purpose, our calling, our endless vigil. And as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, hope will never fade. The end, or perhaps just another beginning in our eternal battle against the shadows. The autumn of 1998 marked my 15th year, a time when boredom and teenage restlessness often led to questionable decisions. My brother Michael, freshly licensed at 17, had been looking for any excuse to drive since getting his license 3 weeks prior. That crisp October evening, we convinced ourselves that deer spotting would be the perfect excuse to take. Bum's weathered Chevrolet Impala for what we promised ourselves would be a quick drive. Our small town in northern Michigan had always been surrounded by dense forests and winding dirt roads, most of them unmarked and barely maintained. The particular road we chose that night was locally known as Miller's Bend, though few people ventured down it anymore since the old Miller farm had been abandoned in the 80s. The narrow path twisted through thick woods, its dirt surface rutted and overgrown, with branches from ancient oaks and maples forming a natural tunnel overhead. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, creating shifting shadows that danced across the road ahead. The autumn air was crisp enough to require jackets, and the occasional dead leaf would skitter across our windshield, carried by the gentle evening breeze. We had our windows cracked just enough to hear any rustling in the woods that might signal the presence of deer. "Keep your light steady," Michael whispered, unnecessarily since we were alone in the car. I held my flashlight out the passenger window, sweeping it across the tree line. The beam caught occasional reflections from dewdrops on leaves, each one momentarily looking like the shine of a deer's eyes before disappointing us. We'd been driving for about 40 minutes, the car crawling along at 15 miles per hour, when the atmosphere began to change. The woods seemed to grow denser, the spaces between trees becoming impenetrable walls of darkness that our lights couldn't penetrate. The air grew noticeably colder, and I rolled up my window, suddenly uncomfortable with how exposed my arm had felt. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep the growing unease out of my voice. "Mom's going to notice the car's gone if we're out much longer." Michael nodded. But before he could respond, we both heard it, the sharp crack of breaking wood, followed by what sounded like multiple feet shuffling through dead leaves. The sound came from no more than 20 feet away, just beyond the reach of our headlights. "Deer," Michael whispered, but his tone suggested he already knew it wasn't. I swung my spotlight toward the sound, my hand trembling slightly. Michael did the same with his light, and in that moment, time seemed to stop. The beams of our flashlights revealed what I can only describe as a nightmare made flesh. Standing in a loose semicircle were 13 people. I remember counting them specifically, though I wish I hadn't. They stood absolutely motionless, their clothing dark and nondescript, but it was their faces that seared themselves into my memory. Each face was completely devoid of expression, pale as milk in our lights, with eyes that seemed to reflect our beams like those of cats. They weren't moving, they weren't speaking, they were just watching us. In the seconds before Michael slammed the car into reverse, my mind registered details that would later wake me from sleep in a cold sweat. Their clothes were outdated, like something from decades past, but not uniformly so, as if they had each stepped out of a different era. One woman wore what looked like a dress from the 1950s, while a man next to her was dressed in what appeared to be clothes from the 1970s. Their faces weren't just blank, they were wrong somehow. The proportions were slightly off, like someone had tried to draw a human face from memory but couldn't quite get it right. Their eyes were too large, their mouths too wide, and none of them blinked, not once in those eternal seconds we stared at them. Michael's reaction saved us. He threw the car into reverse so quickly that the engine protested with a loud whine. The tires spun on the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust and dead leaves. I dropped my flashlight in shock as we jerked backward, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the group. As we backed away, they moved for the first time, but not like normal people would. They all took one synchronized step forward, their movements mechanical and jerky, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. Their heads remained perfectly still, even as their bodies moved. Their eyes locked on us with that same unblinking stare. The car's reverse lights illuminated them from below now, casting strange shadows that made their faces look even more inhuman. In that light, I swear I saw something dark and liquid dripping from the corners of their mouths. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, nearly 2 miles away. Michael's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I realized I had been holding my breath. When I finally exhaled, it came out as a sort of strangled sob. "Did you see?" Michael started, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Their clothes," I whispered, "and they were all from different times. Their faces," he added, his voice shaking. Those couldn't have been real people." We drove home in silence, both of us jumping at every shadow the headlights created. When we parked the car in our driveway, we sat there for several long minutes, neither of us wanting to be the first to step out into the darkness. We never told our parents about what happened that night. How could we? We'd taken the car without permission, trespassed on private property, and seen something impossible. Who would believe us? The few times we tried to discuss it between ourselves, we could never quite capture the true horror of what we'd witnessed. Words seemed inadequate to describe the wrongness of those figures, the way they moved, the empty hunger in their too large eyes. In the days that followed, we scoured local newspapers and the internet for any similar sightings or stories about Miller's Bend. We found nothing concrete, but there were whispers, forum posts about people going missing in those woods over the years, about strange lights and figures seen at night, about sounds that couldn't be explained. 26 years have passed since that night, but the questions still haunt me. Who were they? What were they? Why were they there, standing in formation as if waiting for us? The rational part of my mind tries to explain it away. Maybe they were prankers. Maybe they were members of some strange cult. Maybe it was all somehow a shared hallucination brought on by teenage fears and overactive imaginations. But in my heart, I know what we saw was real. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and pass a particularly dark stretch of woods, I find myself checking my rear-view mirror, half expecting to see those blank faces staring back at me. I avoid dirt roads now, and I never drive in the country after dark if I can help it. Michael and I have families of our own now, living in different states, but every once in a while, one of us will call the other late at night, needing to verify that it really happened, that we both remember the same impossible details. We never mention the dreams, the ones where those figures are walking toward our homes with those same mechanical movements, their two wide mouths finally opening to reveal what lies behind their blank faces. The worst part isn't the memory of what we saw that night. It's the growing certainty that they saw us too, and that somewhere in those dark woods they're still waiting, their unblinking eyes fixed on the road, waiting for the next set of headlights to pierce the darkness. Living in the Metho Valley of Washington State teaches you to question everything you thought you knew about wilderness. The first lesson is that silence here isn't really silence at all. It's a complex language of absences. When the birds suddenly stop singing, when the squirrels cease their endless chatter, when even the wind seems to hold its breath, that's when you know something is watching. I moved here in 2021, after 15 years of city life had worn away at my soul like water on stone. My cabin sits at the edge of what locals call the Deep Valley, where the civilized world begins to fray into true wilderness. The nearest neighbor is 2 miles down an unpaved road that becomes impassable during the worst winter storms. The closest town, little more than a general store and a post office, is a 40-minute drive when the weather cooperates. The isolation shapes you in subtle ways at first. You begin to notice things you never would have in the city. The way shadows move differently when cast by clouds versus branches. The distinct sounds of various animals moving through underbrush. Deer step carefully, bears lumber with surprising grace. Smaller predators like coyotes move with a quick, nervous energy. But some things move without sound at all, and those are the ones you learn to fear most. My first winter here was a harsh education. The snow came early and stayed late, transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The Douglas firs, some older than the United States itself, wore their white mantles like kings, their branches creating Gothic arches overhead. The cold was profound, the kind that makes your bones ache and turns breath into crystal. But it wasn't the cold that made me question my decision to move here. It was the tracks. One morning in December, after a fresh snowfall, I found prints circling my entire cabin. They were huge, roughly the size of my palm, and showed no sign of claw marks, the telltale signature of a large cat. The prints started nowhere and ended nowhere, as if their maker had appeared from thin air, walked a perfect circle around my home while I slept, and then vanished back into the ether. The local game warden later confirmed they belonged to a mountain lion, likely a large male. They're curious, he told me, though his expression suggested there was more to it than that. They like to know what's in their territory. The emphasis he placed on "there" stayed with me. The valley reveals its secrets slowly, like a lover who knows the value of mystery. Each season brings new discoveries, not all of them welcome. Spring thaws uncover deer carcasses cached in snowbanks, preserved all winter by the cold. Summer brings the eerie sound of elk calves calling for mothers that will never answer. Nature's harsh arithmetic played out in voice and silence. Fall paints everything in blood red and dying gold, a reminder that beauty and death are close companions in these woods. But it's the hidden life of the valley that truly commands respect. The bears are obvious in their presence. Broken branches, overturned rocks, scratched trees. The wolves announce themselves with howls that echo off the mountainsides. Even the bobcats and coyotes leave clear signs of their passing. But the mountain lions, they're different. They move like ghosts through the landscape, leaving only the faintest traces of their presence. A tuft of fur on a tree trunk, a scrape of earth covered with leaves and pine needles. The sudden, complete silence of the forest. I learned to read these signs like a book written in a language of absences. When the usual morning chorus of birds fails to materialize, I check the tree line more carefully. When my domestic cats refuse to go outside despite good weather, I pay attention to their instincts. When the hair on the back of my neck stands up for no apparent reason, I trust that ancient part of my brain that remembers what it was like to be prey. The locals have their own stories, shared in low voices over coffee at the general store or whispered around campfires. Tales of livestock found dead with surgical precision, of dogs that disappeared without a trace, of hunters becoming the hunted. Most are probably exaggerated, some perhaps entirely fictional, but they all share a common thread: respect bordering on reverence for the valley's apex predator. They're not like other animals, an old-timer told me once, his weathered face serious in the firelight. Bears, wolves, they're predictable once you learn their ways. But lions, they think, they plan, they remember. He paused, taking a long pull from his coffee. And they hold grudges. I dismissed such talk at first, filed it away with other rural superstitions and campfire tales. But as the seasons turned and I began to truly know the valley, I started to understand. There's a difference between intellectual knowledge and bone-deep understanding. I knew academically that mountain lions were apex predators, but understanding what that really meant, that took time. and one particular encounter that I'll never forget. October 12th, 2023 began like any other autumn day, but looking back, there were signs I should have heeded. The morning frost had melted under a wan sun that seemed afraid to fully commit to the day. The air carried that peculiar October quality, crisp enough to sting your lungs, but with an underlying warmth that whispered of summer's lingering ghost. I had developed a routine over the 2 years I'd lived in the valley. Each afternoon, weather permitting, I'd walk a trail that wound up the hill behind my cabin. It followed an old logging road for the first mile, before branching off into narrower paths that threaded through the forest like veins through tissue. I knew every turn, every significant tree, every viewpoint. Or at least I thought I did. My preparations for these walks had become ritualistic. Water bottle, check. Small first aid kit, check. 9mm pistol in its shoulder holster, check. The weapon was a concession to reality. In wilderness this remote, help is measured in hours, not minutes. I'd never had to use it, but its weight against my ribs had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. That day, I also packed a light jacket, more out of habit than necessity. The forecast had called for mild temperatures, and the afternoon sun had burned away the morning's chill. As I locked my cabin door, I noticed something odd. No bird songs. The usual chickadees and nuthatches that frequented my bird feeders were absent. At the time, I attributed it to the season, to migration patterns I didn't fully understand. The first part of the trail is the steepest, climbing almost vertically through a series of switchbacks. The exertion usually wreaks havoc with my senses, heartbeat pounding in my ears, breathing harsh and loud. But that day, something felt different. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. The usual background noise of small animals going about their business was conspicuously absent. About halfway up the first steep section, I found fresh scat on the trail. It was large, full of fur and bone fragments, and most importantly, still warm. Whatever had left it was close, very close. Again, I ignored the warning sign. After all, I'd seen bear scat on the trail before, had even glimpsed black bears ambling through the underbrush. They generally wanted nothing to do with humans. The climb had warmed me enough to unzip my jacket despite the cool air. Sweat trickled down my back, and my breathing had settled into a steady rhythm. The only sounds were my boots crunching through fallen leaves, and the occasional whisper of wind through the canopy. The North Cascades were visible in the distance, their snow-capped peaks sharp against the blue sky. Looking back, I realized now that the forest had been trying to warn me. The absence of sound wasn't natural. It was a response to a presence that commanded absolute respect from every living thing in its domain. But humans are remarkably good at ignoring what we don't want to acknowledge, at rationalizing away our instinctive fears. I remember thinking how perfect the weather was, how the light filtering through the canopy created patterns on the forest floor, like stained glass in an ancient cathedral. I remember feeling at peace, at home in this wild place. I remember thinking I understood the rhythm of life here. I was wrong. So very wrong. They say time slows down in moments of extreme stress or danger. That's not quite accurate. Time doesn't slow down. Perception speeds up. Your brain, flooded with adrenaline and other survival chemicals, processes information at an incredible rate. Every detail becomes sharp, every sensation amplified to an almost painful degree. I had just rounded a massive ponderosa pine, my hand brushing its reddish bark, when my world changed forever. 20 feet away, descending the slope with the fluid grace of liquid mercury, was the largest mountain lion I had ever seen. The rational part of my brain immediately began cataloging details. Male, easily 180 pounds, possibly 8 or 9 years old judging by his size and condition. Perfect coat, no visible scars, muscles rippling beneath fur that seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that remembers what it was like to be prey, simply screamed, "Apex predator," Every cell in my body recognized that I was in the presence of something that had evolved over millions of years to be the perfect killing machine. His shoulders were as broad as my torso, each muscle group clearly defined beneath his tawny coat. His paws, each larger than my spread hand, moved with deliberate precision. No wasted motion, no uncertainty. His tail, thick as my arm, hung perfectly still behind him. Neither the irritated twitching of an angry cat, nor the preparation for attack. This was something else entirely, but it was his face that truly captured me. Perfectly proportioned, with a jaw that could crush a deer's spine like a handful of twigs. Whiskers that caught the light like strands of silver wire. And his eyes, dear God, his eyes. They were the color of aged amber, but it wasn't the color that held me transfixed. It was the intelligence behind them, an awareness that was utterly alien yet undeniably present. We froze simultaneously, locked in a tableau that could have been painted by a master of wildlife art. He stood slightly above me on the slope, giving him perhaps a foot or two of height advantage. The positioning wasn't lost on either of us. In the language of predator and prey, elevation is everything. His eyes never left mine. I've been stared at by humans in anger, in love, in every emotion imaginable. But nothing prepared me for the intensity of this gaze. It was like being X-rayed, assessed down to the molecular level by eyes that had evolved over millions of years to detect the slightest weakness in potential prey. The 9mm pistol in my shoulder holster might as well have been a child's toy. Mountain lions can cover 40 feet in a single bound, can accelerate from 0 to 35 million ph in 3 strides. By the time my hand reached the holster, it would be far too late. Besides, something told me that drawing a weapon would shatter whatever delicate balance had been struck between us. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The forest around us had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, could feel every bead of sweat rolling down my back despite the cool air. The level of detail my senses were processing was overwhelming. I could see every whisker on his face, count the individual spots on his nose. The muscles in his shoulders and neck were so defined they looked like they had been carved from living stone. I noticed things about myself too, how my breathing had become shallow and quick, how my fingers had gone numb from clenching them so tightly, how my legs trembled slightly from maintaining absolute stillness. The primitive part of my brain kept screaming at me to run, but the rational part knew that would be a death sentence. Running would trigger every predatory instinct he possessed, would transform this strange standoff into a quick and violent end. Minutes stretched like hours. Neither of us moved. Neither of us blinked. The world had narrowed to this single moment, this silent conversation between predator and prey. Because that's what I was in that moment, prey. All my human pretensions, all my technological advantages meant nothing in the face of millions of years of evolved perfection. The intensity of the experience began to take its toll. My legs burned from maintaining perfect stillness. My eyes watered, but I didn't dare blink. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one seeming to echo in the unnatural silence of the forest. The mountain lion's stillness was different. He showed no sign of strain, no indication that maintaining this pose required any effort at all. His breathing was steady, almost hypnotic. Those amber eyes remained fixed on mine, unblinking, unrelenting. In that endless moment, I began to understand something profound about fear. True fear isn't the quick shock of a jump scare or the adrenaline rush of a near miss. True fear is standing at the threshold between life and death, fully aware that you are not the one who gets to choose which side you end up on. The quality of light began to change as the sun moved behind the mountains. Shadows lengthened, taking on strange shapes that seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. The temperature dropped noticeably, but I barely felt it. My entire existence had contracted to this single point in space and time, this eternal moment of assessment. I became aware of a low buzzing in my ears, the sound of my own blood rushing through my veins. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, each pulse a reminder that I was still alive, still breathing, still existing in a world where the next second was not guaranteed. The mountain lion's presence seemed to grow larger, more commanding as the light faded. His coat took on a ghostly quality in the dying light, each muscle still perfectly defined, but now seeming almost supernatural in its perfection. His eyes caught what little light remained and reflected it back with an inner fire that spoke of ancient things, of hunts conducted in darkness, of a lineage that stretched back to when humans were nothing more than clever apes. It could have been 15 minutes or 50. Time had lost all meaning. Then, with deliberate slowness, he blinked. It was like a spell being broken, like the world suddenly remembering how to turn. His chest expanded with a deep breath that seemed to say enough, and with a fluid grace that defied his size, he turned uphill. His departure was neither hurried nor slow. He moved with the confident pace of something that has never needed to rush, never needed to prove anything to anyone. He didn't look back once, which somehow made it more terrifying. He knew exactly where I was, knew exactly what I was doing, without needing to check. I remained frozen for several minutes after he disappeared from view, my body refusing to believe it was over. When I finally managed to move, my legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down on the nearest log. The forest around me slowly came back to life. First a hesitant bird call, then another, then the rustle of small animals resuming their daily routines. The walk back to my cabin was a blur of hyper-awareness and exhaustion. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the undergrowth commanded my complete attention. I kept expecting to see him again, to find him waiting around every bend in the trail. The fact that I didn't see him somehow made it worse. I knew he could be watching me every step of the way, and I would never know. That night, safely back in my cabin with doors locked and lights on, I tried to process what had happened. The encounter had changed something fundamental in my understanding of my place in the world. We humans like to think we've conquered nature, tamed it, risen above it. But in that moment of eye contact with the mountain lion, I understood with perfect clarity that we are still very much a part of the natural world and not always at the top of it. Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound from outside seemed amplified. The wind in the trees became his breathing. The scratch of branches against the roof became his claws. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail, every moment. What if I had moved? What if I had tried to reach for my gun? What if he had chosen differently? The following weeks were marked by a heightened awareness I had never experienced before. Every shadow in the woods seemed to move. Every rustle in the undergrowth commanded my attention. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows, though I knew how meaningless such precautions would be if he decided to come for me. My dreams became vivid and strange. In them, I was always walking that same trail, always rounding that same tree, but the encounters played out differently. Sometimes I ran, sometimes I fought, sometimes I simply stood there until I turned to stone. But always those amber eyes watched, judged, remembered. The local game warden, when I finally told him about the encounter, nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like the big male we've been tracking," he said. "He's been in this valley longer than any of us. Never attacked a human, but he's not afraid of them either. Never attacked a human, that we know of," the warden added after a pause, his weathered face serious in the fluorescent light of his office. "But there have been disappearances over the years. Hikers who went out alone and never came back. Hunters who weren't as skilled as they thought they were. Nothing we could ever prove, of course." He pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer, spreading photos across the surface. Trail camera images, paw prints cast in plaster, livestock kills, all attributed to the same animal. "We estimate his territory covers about 100 square miles, centered right where you had your encounter. He's what we call a ghost cat. Older, smarter, more adapted to human presence than most. They learn our patterns, our weaknesses. They study us. The photos showed an animal that seemed to grow more impressive with each passing year. Unlike most male mountain lions, which start to show their age through scars and worn teeth, this one appeared to be aging like fine wine. His coat remained pristine, his muscles defined, his bearing regal. The most recent photos showed the same animal I'd encountered, a perfect specimen of his species. The nights became the hardest part. Living alone in the woods requires a certain comfort with darkness, but after the encounter, darkness took on new meaning. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow cast by moonlight through the windows carried the possibility of his presence. My domestic cats, usually active at night, became different creatures, alternating between hiding under furniture and staring. Fixedly at the windows, their pupils dilated, their bodies tense. I installed motion sensor lights around the cabin, though locals warned me this might do more harm than good. "Now you'll just know when he's out there," an old-timer told me at the general store, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Sometimes ignorance is better. He was right. The first time those lights clicked on at 3 a.m., illuminating nothing but swaying branches and falling leaves, I spent the rest of the night sitting in my kitchen with my pistol on the table, jumping at every sound. The second time, I saw his tail disappearing around the corner of the cabin, just enough to confirm his presence, to remind me whose territory I was living in. 3 years have passed since that first encounter. The valley has cycled through seasons, winters that buried the world in white silence, springs that erupted in wildflower riots, summers that baked the earth hard as iron, autumns that painted the world in fire colors. Through it all, his presence remained a constant, though rarely seen. I found his tracks many times since then, massive paw prints in fresh snow or mud that could only belong to him. Each time they tell a story. Here he paused to survey the valley. Here he changed direction to parallel my trail. Here he lay in wait above a game path. The tracks never show hesitation or uncertainty. Each step is purposeful, deliberate. The movements of an apex predator, completely at home in his domain. A neighbor's trail camera caught him last month. A ghostly figure moving through the night with the same fluid grace I remembered. The photo confirmed what I already knew. He was still here, still ruling his territory with the quiet confidence that comes from being the ultimate predator. The image showed him looking directly at the camera, those same amber eyes seeming to glow with internal fire. He knew he was being photographed and he didn't care. The encounter changed my relationship with the valley in ways I'm still trying to understand. Some might expect me to feel fear or resentment, to wish for a safer place to live. Instead, I feel a complex mixture of terror and privilege. That mountain lion is a reminder of something ancient and powerful, something that existed long before humans carved roads through these mountains and will likely exist long after we're gone. Sometimes, especially on quiet afternoons when the light filters through the trees just so, I think I feel his presence. It's impossible to know for sure. Mountain lions are masters of stealth, and he could be watching from 20 feet away without my knowledge. But that uncertainty, that knowledge that I share this valley with something so perfectly evolved for survival, has become part of who I am. I've seen many mountain lions in zoos since then, but they might as well be different animals entirely. Those cats, for all their size and strength, are shadows of what I encountered on that hillside. They lack that indefinable quality, that perfect confidence, that absolute mastery of their domain that made my lion so terrifying and magnificent. Last week, I found fresh tracks circling my cabin again, just like that first winter. But this time I noticed something different. The tracks showed he had stopped at each window, had stood there looking in. The implications kept me awake for nights. Was he checking on me? Warning me? Reminding me of my place in his world? The locals have a saying, the valley chooses who stays. Maybe that's true. Or maybe it's the mountain lion who does the choosing. Either way, I remain here, living in a delicate balance with a creature that could end my life any time it chooses. Every morning when I wake up, every time I walk that trail, I know I'm alive because he allows it. He wasn't just a large cat, wasn't just a predator. He was and is a force of nature given form, a reminder that for all our technology and civilization, we still live in a world where tooth and claw hold dominion in the deep woods. He was and remains the most beautiful and terrifying thing I have ever seen. Living here now, I carry that knowledge with me always. Every time I step outside, every time I walk that trail, I know that I'm not just walking through nature, I'm walking through his territory. The pistol still rides in its holster, but I harbor no illusions about its usefulness. I've seen what I am in his eyes, not an enemy, not even a threat, just another creature sharing his domain, allowed to exist at his pleasure. And somehow, that makes me love this place even more. The valley has taught me many things, but the most important lesson came from those amber eyes on that autumn afternoon. True wilderness isn't a place where humans are safe from large predators. It's a place where large predators choose whether humans belong. As I write this, the sun is setting over the valley, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere out there, he's moving through his territory, a shadow among shadows, the ghost of the deep woods. And maybe, just maybe, he's thinking about the human he met on the trail that day, the one who stood still, who met his gaze, who learned to respect the old ways of the valley. Tonight, like every night, I'll lock my doors and windows, knowing full well how meaningless such precautions are against his strength and cunning. I'll lie in bed listening to the night sounds of the valley, trying to distinguish the natural from the supernatural, the harmless from the deadly. And I'll wonder, as I drift off to sleep, whether those amber eyes are watching, waiting, remembering. Because that's what it means to live here, in his valley, under his rules. Every day is a gift, every moment a privilege, every breath a reminder that in the deep woods, humans are not always the apex predator. Sometimes we're just another part of the food chain, allowed to exist by the grace of something older, stronger, and infinitely more perfect than ourselves. And in the end, that's exactly how it should be. The pre-dawn air hung thick and heavy as I shouldered my pack at the Kauai Valley trailhead. It was June 15th, 2023, and at 42, I should have known better than to start a hike with the strange omens I'd encountered that morning. My truck's electrical system had malfunctioned 3 times on the drive up, radio cycling through stations on its own, headlights flickering in patterns that almost seemed like code. The usually bustling morning birds were eerily silent, and even my coffee had tasted wrong, like earth and copper. But 2 decades of hiking these trails had bred a familiarity that bordered on arrogance. I adjusted the worn leather pack against my back, double-checking my supplies, 2 liters of water, high-protein trail mix, first aid kit, emergency flares, and my satellite phone, though cell service was notoriously unreliable in the valley's deeper regions. The brass compass hanging from my neck seemed unusually cold against my skin. A graduation gift from my mother 20 years ago, it had never failed me, even when modern GPS units lost their signals in the valley's mysterious magnetic anomalies. The leather cord had been replaced countless times, but the compass itself remained as reliable as the day she'd given it to me. Or at least it had been until today. As I conducted my usual compass check before starting down the trail, the needle spun wildly, making complete rotations before stopping at a point that absolutely wasn't north. I tapped the glass, frowning. The needle jumped again, then settled, pointing directly into the valley's heart, about 47 degrees off from true north. I blamed it on the area's known magnetic peculiarities and made a mental note to get it checked when I returned. The trail started its descent through a stand of ancient Ohialewa trees, their crimson blossoms unusually abundant for this time of year. The flowers seemed to pulse slightly in the pre-dawn light, like dying embers or beating hearts. A light mist clung to the ground, swirling around my boots in ways that defied the still air. The first mile was deceptively normal, though the silence pressed against my ears like cotton wool. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, not even the usual rustle of leaves in the wind. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my increasingly deliberate breathing. The humidity was oppressive, making each breath feel like drinking warm soup. Around the 2nd-mile marker, a carved wooden post that I could have sworn had different symbols on it than yesterday, I noticed the first truly wrong thing: my boot prints in the muddy trail ahead of me. Fresh ones, leading down the path I hadn't taken yet. I stopped, studying them carefully. The tread pattern matched my hiking boots exactly, down to the distinctive wear pattern on the right heel where I'd stepped on a nail last month. But that was impossible. I was the first hiker on the trail today. I'd checked the log at the ranger station. As I stood there puzzling over the prints, a sound echoed through the valley, something between a bird call and a human scream, but distorted, as if played backwards. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mist thickened, taking on a slightly reddish tinge. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn back. Every instinct honed by years of wilderness experience screamed danger. But something else pulled at me, a compulsion to continue that felt external, like a hook behind my sternum, drawing me deeper into the valley. The vegetation grew denser as I descended, but wrong somehow. Ferns that should have been green displayed subtle patterns of deep purple and blue when you looked at them from the corner of your eye. Vines seemed to retract just before I could touch them, and more than once I swore I saw them moving against gravity. The trail itself began to feel uncertain under my feet. Steps that looked solid would suddenly give way to unsettling softness, while apparent mud patches proved mysteriously firm. The slope's angle seemed to change between blinks, sometimes feeling like I was walking downhill, sometimes up, even though I knew I was descending steadily into the valley. 3 hours in, I found the first piece of trash, a red plastic cup half buried in the mud. But something was wrong with it. The plastic looked too old, degraded in ways that shouldn't be possible for something recently discarded. When I picked it up, the material felt warm and slightly pulsing, like living tissue. I dropped it immediately, but when it hit the ground, it made a sound like distant laughter. More debris appeared along the trail, beer bottles filled with liquid that wasn't beer, moving shadows visible through the glass. Aluminum cans crushed into impossible shapes, some forming patterns that resembled ancient Hawaiian petroglyphs. A discarded phone with its screen cracked in a fractal pattern that seemed to extend deeper than the phone's thickness should allow. I collected the trash as I always did, following my mother's teaching to leave places better than I found them. But each piece added weight to my pack that didn't match its size. By the 4th hour of hiking, my shoulders ached as if I were carrying stones instead of empty containers. The deeper I went, the more the valley seemed to warp around me. Time became fluid. My watch would show 9:15 a.m. for 20 minutes, then suddenly jumped to 2:45 p.m., then back to 10:23 a.m. The sun, visible through breaks in the canopy, appeared to jump positions in the sky, sometimes shining from impossible angles. I began to hear music, faint at first, like a radio playing from a great distance. But as I continued down the trail, the sound clarified into something that made my skin crawl. It was technically music, yes, a heavy bass line and synthetic beats, but layered over it was something else. Chanting in a language that sounded ancient, voices that seemed to come from throats not meant for human speech. The waterfall was close now. I could hear its thunder growing louder, but the sound wasn't right either. The rhythm of falling water seemed to form words just on the edge of comprehension, like a conversation in a language I should know, but couldn't quite remember. As I approached the final bend before the waterfall clearing, I smelled wood smoke and cooking meat. Voices carried on the heavy air, young, drunk, loud. But underneath their laughter was another sound, a deeper rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from the earth itself. I paused at the trail's edge, hidden behind a curtain of ferns that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. Through the fronds, I could see 5 figures around a makeshift campsite near the waterfall's base. They were young, early 20s probably, and from their expensive but inappropriate hiking gear and the way they moved through the space, I could tell they were tourists who had no business being this deep in the valley. But something else was wrong with the scene. The waterfall behind them seemed to flow at different speeds in different sections, sometimes appearing to move upward. Shadows around their campsite didn't fall in the right directions, and occasionally, when none of them were looking, their belongings would shift positions slightly, as if moved by invisible hands. What happened next would challenge everything I thought I knew about these islands, about reality itself, and about the ancient powers that still patrol these sacred spaces, enforcing laws far older than anything written in human books. I studied the group through the ferns, which now seemed to be arranging themselves to give me a clearer view, their fronds moving with deliberate purpose. The 5 tourists were sprawled around their campsite, which looked like a wound in the ancient landscape. Their expensive gear, probably purchased specifically for this trip, was scattered carelessly across sacred ground that had once been kapu, forbidden to all but the most holy of Hawaiian priests. The tallest of the men, who I would come to think of as the marked one, bore a fresh tribal tattoo that seemed to writhe on his skin when he moved. Not the subtle shift of muscles under ink, but something more disturbing, as if the patterns were trying to rearrange themselves into different shapes, ancient symbols bleeding through the modern design. The 2 women sat on a fallen log that I knew hadn't been there yesterday. One wore pristine white shorts that somehow remained unblemished despite the mud and vegetation. The other clutched a beer bottle, but I noticed she never actually drank, who from it just lifted it to her lips and pretended, as if afraid of what might actually be inside. Their Bluetooth speaker pumped out distorted music that seemed to skip and stutter in patterns that made my teeth ache. Sometimes, between songs, I could hear older music bleeding through, the hollow tone of bamboo flutes and the deep resonance of pahu drums that hadn't been played in this valley for centuries. The 3rd man, shorter but muscled like a cage fighter, kept glancing into the forest with nervous energy. Perhaps he sensed what I was starting to see, the shadows that moved independent of any light source, the brief glimpses of figures standing in the mist only to vanish when looked at directly. His instincts were screaming danger, but his modern mind couldn't process what his ancient hindbrain was trying to tell him. The last member of their group, a quieter man who kept to the periphery, was doing something that made my blood run cold. He was stacking stones, 3 stones, balanced impossibly on their points, identical to the formations I'd seen along the trail. But his eyes were glazed, movements mechanical, as if his hands were being guided by something else. Their campsite was littered with those red cups and beer bottles, but now I noticed they formed subtle patterns on the ground, curves and lines that seemed random at first glance, but slowly resolved into shapes I recognized from ancient petroglyphs, symbols of warning, of boundaries crossed, of kapu broken. I knew I had to make my presence known before. Something else did. The air was growing thicker, the mist taking on that reddish tinge again. The waterfall's roar had developed a rhythm that sounded almost like words in Hawaiian, almost like chanting, almost like screaming. I stepped out of the ferns, deliberately scuffing my boots on the rocks. The group's heads turned toward me with unnatural synchronization, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, their eyes all reflected red in the strange light, like animals caught in a flash. "Aloha," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the wrongness that permeated the clearing. I held up my trash bag, now heavy with their discarded debris. I believe some of this belongs to your group." The marked one stood, moving, with a swagger that seemed hollow, performative, as if he were playing a role he thought he should play. But there was fear under it. I could smell it on him, see it in the way his new tattoo seemed to squirm beneath his skin. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. But his voice wavered slightly as a shadow passed over us, too large to be a cloud, too solid to be a bird, too silent to be a helicopter. None of them looked up. Sometimes not seeing is a self-defense mechanism. "Just a local who loves these trails," I replied, setting my pack down slowly. As it touched the ground, I noticed the earth seemed to shift beneath it, as if reaching up to cradle it. "I'm not here to cause trouble, just hoping we can keep the valley clean." The muscled one moved to flank me, but his path took him through one of the red cup patterns on the ground. As his foot crossed the invisible line they created, a sound like breaking glass echoed through the clearing, but nothing had broken. He stumbled, suddenly unsure of his footing on the perfectly flat ground. "What are you, some kind of park ranger?" the marked one slurred, but his words seemed to echo strangely, as if multiple voices were speaking almost, but not quite, in sync. "No, nothing official," I said, still holding up the bag. "But this is sacred ground you're standing on. Our ancestors considered this valley kapu, forbidden to enter without proper respect. The least we can do is not leave our trash behind." As I spoke those words, the air grew suddenly heavy, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. The waterfall's roar dimmed to a whisper, and in the sudden quiet, we could all hear it, the sound of footsteps in the forest. Heavy footsteps, much too heavy to be human, moving with deliberate purpose through the undergrowth that surrounded the clearing. The marked one's face darkened at my mention of Kapu, but something else darkened with it. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, to move against the light in ways that shadows shouldn't. His tattoo was definitely moving now, the tribal patterns, flowing like black water under his skin, occasionally forming ancient Hawaiian symbols before dissolving back into meaningless curves. "Sacred ground? Man, this is public land. We can do whatever the hell we want here." His words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment the waterfall seemed to pause, countless gallons of water freezing in mid-fall. None of the others appeared to notice this impossible pause, but I saw the quieter man's hands begin to shake as he stacked another set of stones, his eyes now completely white, rolled back in their sockets. The woman in white shorts stood suddenly, swaying slightly. Did anyone else hear that? She was staring into the forest where the footsteps had gone quiet. Too quiet. The entire valley seemed to be listening, waiting. The muscled man took another step toward me, but stopped abruptly as his foot broke through another pattern of discarded cups. This time, the sound wasn't like breaking glass, it was like breaking bones, a sharp crack that echoed off the valley. Walls in impossible ways, returning to us distorted, almost like laughter. That's when I noticed the water in the pool at the base of the waterfall had taken on a reddish tinge, not the brown of disturbed sediment, but a deep, vital red that pulsed with its own light. The woman with the beer bottle saw it too. She finally took a drink, then dropped the bottle with a scream. It shattered on the rocks, but instead of beer, thick red mud poured out, forming symbols on the ground that glowed briefly before sinking into the earth. A wind picked up, but it wasn't natural. It moved in circles around the clearing, gaining strength, carrying with it the scent of root systems and grave dirt and something older, something that smelled like mountains grinding together deep underground. The wind had a voice, many voices, whispering in ancient Hawaiian, the words just beyond my understanding. The muscled man reached for me, but his swing went wide as movement caught everyone's attention. Above the waterfall, a figure had appeared. Tall, impossibly tall. its height made more disturbing by its proportions being exactly human, just scaled up to tremendous size. It wore what appeared to be traditional Hawaiian warrior's attire, but the kapa cloth moved wrong, seeming to flutter in a different wind than the one that whipped through our clearing. The woman in white shorts screamed, a genuine sound of terror that cut through the wind's voices, and pointed behind me. I began to turn, my body moving with the trained slowness of someone who knows that sudden movements can trigger predator responses. But before I could complete the motion, before I could see what had emerged from the forest behind me, the air was split by a sharp crack. The marked one dropped to his knees, blood streaming between his fingers where he clutched the back of his head. What had struck him rolled to a stop at my feet. A ma, a Hawaiian war club stone, perfectly formed and polished to a shine that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Symbols were carved into its surface, ancient ones that seemed to move and change when viewed directly, but remained clear and terrible in peripheral vision. The stone was slick with water, but not from the falls. This water was cold, ancient, tasting of depths that hadn't seen sunlight since the islands were young. I knew this because I could taste it without touching it, could feel its age on my tongue, could sense the weight of centuries it carried. More figures were appearing now, emerging from behind trees that weren't thick enough to have hidden them, stepping out of shadows too shallow to have contained them. They were all enormous, all dressed in ancient Hawaiian warrior garb, all moving with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the normal constraints of human movement. The group's Bluetooth speaker erupted in a squeal of static, then began playing, something that wasn't in its memory. The deep boom of pahu drums and the hollow voices of bamboo flutes, overlaid with chanting that made the modern concrete foundations of my scientific worldview crack and crumble. The warriors, if that's what they were, had formed a circle around the clearing, each at least 12 feet tall, their features hidden behind ancient war masks that seemed to shift between wood, stone, and living flesh. The spaces between them were filled with moving shadows that suggested even more figures, these ones twisted into shapes that the human mind refused to fully process. The quiet man who had been stacking stones suddenly spoke, but his voice wasn't his own. Deep and resonant, it contained multiple tones, as if many voices were speaking in perfect unison. The words were in Hawaiian, ancient Hawaiian, but somehow I understood them. "You have broken the kapu. The valley demands payment." His eyes were still rolled back, showing only whites, and dark tears of what looked like mud streaked down his face. The stones he'd been stacking began to vibrate, then shattered into fine dust that hung in the air, forming complex symbols that glowed with an inner light before being absorbed into his skin. The muscled man broke first, turning to run down the trail. He made it 3 steps before the ground beneath his feet became fluid, like quicksand, but thick and red. He sank to his knees before anyone could react. The earth made a sound like swallowing. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice carrying more authority than I felt. "There's a protocol, a way to make this right." I was speaking from instinct, from half-remembered stories my grandmother had told me, from knowledge that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep in my ancestral memory. The warriors turned their masked faces toward me in perfect synchronization. The wind died completely, leaving us in a pocket of absolute silence. Even the waterfall had gone quiet, its waters now flowing upward, defying gravity as reality continued to break down around us. The marked one was still on his knees, blood running down his neck, but the blood was moving wrong, flowing upward against his skin, being absorbed back into the wound. His tattoo had completely transformed now, the modern tribal design replaced by authentic Hawaiian patterns that spelled out his transgressions in an ancient script. "I take responsibility for them," I said, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought. "I will ensure the protocols are followed, the valley will be cleaned, the proper respects will be paid." The woman in white shorts had begun to float slightly, her feet several inches off the ground. Her pristine shorts were now covered in symbols that appeared to have been there for centuries. The white fabric aged and stained with designs that told stories of ancient judgments and forgotten punishments. The giant warrior directly in front of me took a step forward. The ground shook with the impact, and cracks spread outward from his foot, glowing with the same red light that now pulsed through the waterfall. When he spoke, his voice was like volcanic rocks grinding together. "You claim the right of intervention?" A massive hand reached up, removing his mask. What lay beneath was not a face, but rather a swirling void, filled with stars and ancient constellations that had different names now. By what authority? The compass at my neck had begun to burn cold, the metal taking on a blue-white glow. Without conscious decision, I grasped it, held it up. The needle spun wildly before pointing directly at the warrior's stellar void of a face. Recognition seemed to ripple through the assembled figures. The possessed, quiet man spoke again, his voice now layered with even more tones. "The bloodline remains. The old knowledge lives." The woman with the beer bottle began to scream, not in fear, but in the same multi-layered voice, adding her tones to the quiet man's. The sound they produced together was like a chord struck on an instrument built from mountains and played with lightning. The Marked One's tattoo had finally settled into its new form, a complete traditional pair that wrapped around his torso, telling the true story of this place in symbols that burned with black light. He began to speak too, his voice joining the chord, though his conscious mind had clearly retreated from what was happening. The warrior raised his hand, and reality bent around the gesture. The air itself seemed to part, revealing layers of time beneath, glimpses of this same clearing through the centuries, occupied by different figures, different ceremonies, different judgments. In some layers, the waterfall flowed with light instead of water. In others, the ground was covered with offerings that writhed and pulsed with their own inner life. "The old blood speaks," the warrior said, stars wheeling in the void where his face should be. "But blood alone is not enough. Knowledge must be proven. Power must be earned." My compass burst apart in my hands, but instead of brass fragments, it released a swarm of tiny lights that swirled around me like fireflies made of blue fire. They settled into my skin, burning like ice, searing ancient symbols into my flesh beneath my clothes. Each point of light carried a memory, not mine, but my ancestors, of protocols and powers and prices paid. The woman in white shorts was fully airborne now, rotating slowly as her clothes continued to age and transform. The white fabric had become traditional kappa cloth, but the patterns spreading across it were wrong, moving too fast, showing too many faces, too many screaming mouths. The muscled man was chest-deep in the living earth now, but time had begun to move strangely around him. He seemed to age and regress randomly, one moment a child, the next an old man, then back to his present self. Each transformation accompanied by a sound like pottery breaking. "The valley demands balance," the possessed quiet man intoned, more voices joining his with each word until it was a chorus of thousands speaking in perfect unison. Blood spilled must be answered. Sacred spaces defiled must be cleansed. The old ways must be honored. The Marked One's new tattoos had begun to move again, but now they were crawling off his skin, becoming three-dimensional, reaching out into the air like black tentacles made of living ink. They formed shapes in the space above him, scenes from ancient Hawaii, battles and ceremonies, sacrifices and celebrations. My skin felt too tight, as if something was trying to emerge from inside me. The memories burned by the compass lights were integrating themselves into my consciousness, showing me things that no living human was meant to remember. I saw the valley's true purpose, not just a place of beauty, but a nexus, a point where the ancient powers of Hawaii remained raw and untamed. The woman with the beer bottle had collapsed, but her shadow remained standing, growing taller, spreading out to join the shadows of the warriors. Her body began to sink into the ground, but unlike the muscled man's violent submergence, she descended gently, as if being accepted rather than consumed. The warrior gestured again, and reality buckled. The waterfall split into multiple streams, each flowing in a different direction, some defying gravity, others flowing through time rather than space. Between the streams, I could see other clearings, other groups being judged, other guardians enforcing other laws. The boundaries between past and present, between physical and spiritual, were dissolving. "Choose," the warrior commanded, his voice shaking the mountains themselves. "Choose who will pay the price. Choose who will carry the burden. Choose who will remember." The knowledge burned into me by the compass showed me what he meant. Someone had to be marked as a keeper of this place, bound to it, responsible for its protection, forever changed by its power. The modern world had forgotten these obligations, but the ancient powers hadn't forgotten their right to demand them. The marked one's living tattoos had fully separated from his skin now, dancing in the air like auroras made of darkness. They began to reach toward me, carrying more knowledge, more memories, more power, but also a terrible responsibility. Around us, the circle of warriors began to move, not stepping but gliding, creating a slow rotation that made the stars visible through their void faces blur into streaks of light. The quiet man's chant had grown so complex that it was distorting the air around him, creating ripples in reality through which other versions of the clearing could be seen, some beautiful, some terrible, all sacred in their own way. His eyes had begun to glow with the same starlight that filled the warriors' masks. The choice was made in a moment of clarity between heartbeats. The ancient knowledge flowing through me showed the pattern, the price, the purpose. I stepped forward into the circle of living tattoos that had risen from the marked one's skin. They struck like serpents, burning into my flesh with a cold fire that reached past bone and muscle to touch something deeper. The part of me that had always known this would happen had been waiting for it since I first set foot in this valley decades ago. The muscled man vanished completely into the earth with a sound like a closing tomb. His final scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a deep resonance that seemed to come from the island itself. The ground where he disappeared hardened instantly, leaving behind a perfect petroglyph carved into stone, a warning to future trespassers. The woman in white shorts descended slowly, her clothes now completely transformed into ancient kappa cloth covered in living symbols. When her feet touched the ground, she collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, but her shadow remained upright, stretching to join the warrior's circle. Reality cracked further. The waterfall separated into 1,000 streams, each flowing through a different time, different dimension. Through the gaps between the water, I glimpsed ancient ceremonies, future warnings, eternal moments where the valley's guardians had enacted their judgments across centuries. My skin split along invisible seams, releasing not blood but light, the same starlight that filled the warriors' masks. The tattoos from the marked one writhed and merged with this light, forming new patterns that told the valley's true story, its laws, its demands. My bones hummed with ancient frequencies, resonating with chants that had never stopped being sung in the deep places. The quiet man's voice had become a vortex of sound, pulling in all other noises until even the warriors' movements became silent. His chant spoke of obligations older than the islands themselves, of powers that had ridden the lava flows up from Earth's core, of contracts written in stone and blood and starlight. The woman with the beer bottle's body had fully merged with the earth, but her consciousness expanded outward, becoming part of the valley's awareness. I could feel her thoughts dissolving into the greater pattern, adding her story to the countless others held in the land's memory. The marked one screamed as his modern tattoo was completely consumed, replaced by a true marking that would forever remind him of this day. He would live, would return to the modern world, but would carry a visible warning to others who might think to disrespect the sacred places. The warrior with the void face reached out with a hand large enough to crush me. Instead, it passed through my chest, connecting directly with whatever ancestral spark had recognized this power. Knowledge flooded in. Generations of secrets, protocols, true names of places and powers. My consciousness expanded to fill the entire valley, touching every root and stone, feeling the weight of centuries press against my awareness. The transformation burned through me like lightning through a storm cloud. I was becoming something else, something both more and less than human. The valley's power rewrote me on a molecular level, changing not just what I was, but what I had always been. Past and future aligned, showing me my true purpose. I had not discovered this power. It had grown me to be its vessel. Time fractured around us. Through the cracks, I could see my own past visits to this valley, now understanding they had all been tests, preparation for this moment. I saw future visits too, where I would stand guard, enforcing the old laws, protecting the balance between worlds. The circle of warriors began to spin faster, their forms blurring into a wall of living shadow and ancient starlight. The void-faced one spoke one final time, his words carving themselves into my transformed flesh. The valley accepts your offering. The balance is restored. The kapu will be maintained. Reality snapped back like a rubber band, the clearing returning to apparent normalcy. But everything had changed. The remaining tourists lay unconscious on the ground, their memories already being rewritten by powers that had millennia of practice at hiding their existence. The waterfall flowed normally again, but I could now see the patterns in it, could read the messages in its motion. I had become something new, something ancient, something necessary. The valley's power thrummed through me like a second heartbeat. There would be other groups, other trespassers, other choices to be made. The old powers had reclaimed their territory, and I was now their agent, their guardian, their warning. The first law of power is that it demands to be used. The second is that it always requires payment. I had paid with my humanity, or at least pieces of it. But I had gained something else, something that had been waiting in my blood since my ancestors first set foot on these islands. The modern world could forget the old powers, but the old powers never forgot themselves, and now neither would I. The sun shifted, casting light through leaves that now responded to my will rather than the winds. The surviving tourists would wake soon, their minds carefully edited by powers older than thought. But first, there was the matter of my transformation to complete. The warrior circle began to collapse inward, each massive figure dissolving into streams of living shadow that poured into me like liquid night. With each absorption, I gained their knowledge, centuries of guardianship, millennia of secrets. I learned the true names of every stone in the valley, the ancient words that could turn air solid and make water burn, the songs that could call mountains from their sleep. My compass had reformed around my neck, but it was no longer mere brass. The metal had become something older than human metallurgy, something that had been pulled from the core of the first island to rise from the sea. The needle no longer pointed north. It pointed to wherever balance needed to be restored. The marked one stirred first, his new tattoos now settled into their final form. They told my story, our story, in symbols that would appear meaningless to modern eyes, but would serve as a warning to any who could still read the old signs. He would return to his world changed, a walking reminder that some places remained beyond human ownership. The woman in white shorts, her clothes forever transformed by their contact with ancient power, would wake with dreams she couldn't quite remember, but would never quite forget. Her art, I now knew she was a painter, would take a darker turn, her hands creating images of tall figures with star-filled voids for faces, of valleys that breathed, of waters that flowed upward. The quiet man's role had been the most crucial. His voluntary surrender to possession had opened the door between worlds wide enough for the full power to manifest. He would remember everything, but would find himself physically unable to speak of it. Instead, he would return again and again to sacred places, leaving his carefully balanced stone markers as warnings or welcomes, depending on who passed by. The woman in white shorts descended slowly, her clothes now completely transformed into ancient kappa cloth covered in living symbols. When her feet touched the ground, she collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, but her shadow remained upright, stretching to join the warrior's circle. Reality cracked further. The waterfall separated into 1,000 streams, each flowing through a different time, different dimension. Through the gaps between the water, I glimpsed ancient ceremonies, future warnings, eternal moments where the valley's guardians had enacted their judgments across centuries. My skin split along invisible seams, releasing not blood but light, the same starlight that filled the warriors' masks. The tattoos from the marked one writhed and merged with this light, forming new patterns that told the valley's true story, its laws, its demands. My bones hummed with ancient frequencies, resonating with chants that had never stopped being sung in the deep places. The quiet man's voice had become a vortex of sound, pulling in all other noises until even the warriors' movements became silent. His chant spoke of obligations older than the islands themselves, of powers that had ridden the lava flows up from Earth's core, of contracts written in stone and blood and starlight. The woman with the beer bottle's body had fully merged with the earth, but her consciousness expanded outward, becoming part of the valley's awareness. I could feel her thoughts dissolving into the greater pattern, adding her story to the countless others held in the land's memory. The marked one screamed as his modern tattoo was completely consumed, replaced by a true marking that would forever remind him of this day. He would live, would return to the modern world, but would carry a visible warning to others who might think to disrespect the sacred places. The warrior with the void face reached out with a hand large enough to crush me. Instead, it passed through my chest, connecting directly with whatever ancestral spark had recognized this power. Knowledge flooded in, generations of secrets, protocols, true names of places and powers. My consciousness expanded to fill the entire valley, touching every root and stone, feeling the weight of centuries press against my awareness. The transformation burned through me like lightning through a storm cloud. I was becoming something else, something both more and less than human. The valley's power rewrote me on a molecular level, changing not just what I was, but what I had always been. Past and future aligned, showing me my true purpose. I had not discovered this power. It had grown me to be its vessel. Time fractured around us. Through the cracks, I could see my own past visits to this valley, now understanding they had all been tests, preparation for this moment. I saw future visits too, where I would stand guard, enforcing the old laws, protecting the balance between worlds. The circle of warriors began to spin faster, their forms blurring into a wall of living shadow and ancient starlight. The void-faced one spoke one final time, his words carving themselves into my transformed flesh. The valley accepts your offering. The balance is restored. The kapu will be maintained. Reality snapped back like a rubber band, the clearing returning to apparent normalcy. But everything had changed. The remaining tourists lay unconscious on the ground, their memories already being rewritten by powers that had millennia of practice at hiding their existence. The waterfall flowed normally again, but I could now see the patterns in it, could read the messages in its motion. I had become something new, something ancient, something necessary. The valley's power thrummed through me like a second heartbeat. There would be other groups, other trespassers, other choices to be made. The old powers had reclaimed their territory, and I was now their agent, their guardian, their warning. The first law of power is that it demands to be used. The second is that it always requires payment. I'd paid with my humanity, or at least pieces of it. But I had gained something else, something that had been waiting in my blood since my ancestors first set foot on these islands. The modern world could forget the old powers. But the old powers never forgot themselves, and now neither would I. The sun shifted, casting light through leaves that now responded to my will rather than the winds. The surviving tourists would wake soon, their minds carefully edited by powers older than thought. But first, there was the matter of my transformation to complete. The warrior circle began to collapse inward, each massive figure dissolving into streams of living shadow that poured into me like liquid night. With each absorption, I gained their knowledge, centuries of guardianship, millennia of secrets. I learned the true names of every stone in the valley, the ancient words that could turn air solid and make water burn, the songs that could call mountains from their sleep. My compass had reformed around my neck, but it was no longer mere brass. The metal had become something older than human metallurgy, something that had been pulled from the core of the first island to rise from the sea. The needle no longer pointed north. It pointed to wherever balance needed to be restored. The marked one stirred first, his new tattoos now settled into their final form. They told my story, our story, in symbols that would appear meaningless to modern eyes, but would serve as a warning to any who could still read the old signs. He would return to his world changed, a walking reminder that some places remained beyond human ownership. The woman in white shorts, her clothes forever transformed by their contact with ancient power, would wake with dreams she couldn't quite remember, but would never quite forget. Her art, I now knew she was a painter, would take a darker turn, her hands creating images of tall figures with star-filled voids for faces, of valleys that breathed, of waters that flowed upward. The quiet man's role had been the most crucial. His voluntary surrender to possession had opened the door between worlds wide enough for the full power to manifest. He would remember everything, but would find himself physically unable to speak of it. Instead, he would return again and again to sacred places, leaving his carefully balanced stone markers as warnings or welcomes, depending on who passed by. The woman with the beer bottle had been fully absorbed into the valley's consciousness, her modern identity dissolved, but her essence preserved as part of the eternal awareness that flowed through every root and stone. She had become part of the power that would fuel future judgments, future transformations, future restorations of balance. Only the muscled man had been completely removed, his defiance and disrespect requiring the strongest response. The earth had taken him, but not to death. He would emerge years later, changed and humbled, in another sacred place that needed a guardian. The valley was not cruel, but it was absolute in its requirements. I felt my body continuing to change at the molecular level. My bones became something denser than mere calcium. My blood now carried starlight along with oxygen. My eyes could see through time as easily as through space. The transformation wasn't painful anymore. Pain requires limitations, and I was becoming something beyond normal physical constraints. The ancient powers settled into my altered flesh like well-worn clothing, comfortable but weighted with responsibility. I could feel every root in the valley, every drop of water, every grain of volcanic soil. More than that, I could feel the threads of power that connected this place to others like it, a web of sacred spaces that still hummed with the old frequencies, still maintained the balance between worlds. The sun reached its zenith, and with its peak, my transformation completed. I was still human enough to walk among others, but I was also something else. A bridge between worlds, a guardian of boundaries, a keeper of laws older than humanity's memory of law. The tourists began to wake, their memories carefully reconstructed to explain their injuries and exhaustion as the results of a simple hiking accident. They would leave changed, marked in subtle ways that only other guardians would recognize. Their story would spread in whispers, adding to the valley's protection, a modern myth built around an ancient truth. I gathered their remaining trash, but now each piece burned to ash at my touch, returning to the elements without leaving traces of human carelessness. The valley would remain clean, would remain sacred, would remain protected. Night was falling as I began my first patrol as guardian. The stars emerged, but they were no longer distant lights. They were eyes, watching, approving, remembering. The ancient powers had reclaimed one of their own, had restored a balance that had been tilted for too long. The valley breathed around me, and I breathed with it. There would be other trespassers, other judgments, other transformations. But for now, in this moment between moments, I simply existed in my new reality, feeling the power flow through me like time itself, eternal and unstoppable as the tide. This was just the beginning. The old powers were awakening across the islands, reclaiming their territories, recruiting their guardians. The modern world was about to remember why some places had been kept taboo, why some boundaries should never be crossed, why some powers should never be forgotten. And I would be there, watching, waiting, maintaining the balance between what was and what must never be again. The memory still haunts me even now. I was 16 then, not 14, as I sometimes mistakenly recall. Perhaps my mind's attempt to distance itself from what happened that late October afternoon in 2019. My brother Wesley was 11, a quiet kid who'd always been more attuned to the subtle whispers of the world than I ever was. Looking back, I should have listened to him more carefully that day. The air had that particular autumn bite to it, the kind that makes your nose run and your cheeks flush red. Dead leaves crunched beneath our boots as Dad led us through the ancient forest that bordered our property in northern Michigan. The sun was already low, painting the skeletal branches above us in shades of burnt orange and blood red. We'd done this trek dozens of times before. It was our tradition, heading out for the evening hunt when the deer were most active. I remember checking my watch, 4:47 p.m. Sunset would be around 6:15. We had time, but not much. Dad carried his trusted Remington 700, the same rifle he'd used for 20 years. I had my smaller .243 Winchester, and Wesley, too young to hunt, carried only his binoculars and that worn notebook he always kept in his jacket pocket. The first warning came about 15 minutes into our hike. Wesley's hand suddenly clamped onto my sleeve, his fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. His eyes were fixed on a point between two ancient oaks about 30 yards ahead. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the endless maze of trees and the growing shadows between them. "Probably just a branch moving in the wind," I said, trying to sound reassuring. But there was no wind that day. The forest was unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Wesley's grip tightened. "No," he insisted. "It was wrong, like a person, but not." He swallowed hard. "Its neck was too long." I shrugged off his hand, perhaps too roughly. "It's your imagination, Wes. Come on. We're falling behind, Dad." I regret that moment more than almost anything else in my life. If I had only taken him seriously, if I had only listened. We continued walking, following Dad's silent footsteps as he led us deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow closer together here, their branches interweaving overhead until only occasional shafts of the dying sunlight penetrated the canopy. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. I was focused on watching Dad's back, trying to mirror his careful movements, when I realized something was wrong. The rhythm of footsteps behind me had changed. The familiar three-beat pattern of our walk had become a duet. I turned around, expecting to see Wesley just a few feet behind me. Instead, I found empty air. The forest path stretched back into deepening shadows, but my brother was nowhere to be seen. "Wesley!" I called out, trying to keep my voice low enough not to spook any nearby game, but loud enough to carry. No response. "Wesley!" I called again, louder this time, my hunter's discretion forgotten. Dad turned at my shout, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he registered Wesley's absence. "When did you last hear him?" he asked, quickly moving back to where I stood. Just a minute ago, maybe 2. But even as I said it, I realized I wasn't sure. Time seemed to have gone strange and fluid, like honey dripping from a jar. Had it been a minute? 5? 10? We began searching immediately, retracing our steps. Dad took the lead, his rifle now held ready, not for deer, but for whatever might have taken his youngest son. I followed slightly behind and to his left, scanning the forest floor for signs of tracks, broken branches, anything that might indicate where Wesley had gone. The forest had changed somehow. The familiar trails we'd walked countless times before seemed to twist in new and confusing ways. Landmarks I thought I recognized appeared in the wrong places, as if the woods were rearranging itself around us. The shadows grew longer, darker, and seemed to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. Time became meaningless as we searched. Dad's calls for Wesley grew increasingly desperate, echoing through the trees only to be swallowed by the unnatural silence that had descended over the forest. No birds called. No squirrels rustled through the fallen leaves. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving us in a pocket of stagnant, increasingly cold air. I checked my watch again. 5:22 p.m. We had less than an hour of daylight left, and the darkness under the trees was already deepening. My flashlight was in my backpack, but somehow the thought of seeing what might be lurking in the shadows filled me with a nameless dread. "Over here!" Dad's voice cut through my thoughts. I rushed toward him, hope rising in my chest, only to have it crushed when I saw what he'd found. Wesley's notebook, lying open on a bed of leaves. The pages were blank, except for the last one, which contained a single line of Wesley's usually neat handwriting, now jagged and rushed. "It's not right. It's not right. It's not right. It's not." The words trailed off the page in a violent scrawl, as if he'd been writing while running, or while being dragged. At 5:45 p.m., just as the last direct sunlight was fading from the forest, we found Wesley, or rather, he found us. He simply walked out from behind a massive oak tree, as casual as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. But something was terribly wrong. His clothes were covered in thick black mud, despite there being no muddy areas anywhere near our hunting grounds. His eyes seemed somehow different, still his, but with something else looking out through them. "Wesley!" Dad rushed forward, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Son, where have you been? What happened?" Wesley looked at him with a strange, vacant expression. "I never left," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I've been with you the whole time." "No, you haven't," I said, stepping closer. "You've been gone for almost an hour. We've been searching everywhere. Your notebook?" I held up the evidence of his disappearance. He glanced at the notebook without interest, as if it belonged to someone else. "I never left," he repeated. "I've always been here. I've always been here. I've always been here." Each repetition came in exactly the same tone, like a recording being played back. Dad made the decision to end the hunting trip immediately. The sun was nearly gone, and whatever had happened to Wesley needed to be addressed. We began the walk back to our truck, with Wesley between us this time. Every few minutes, I caught him moving his head in strange, jerking motions, as if tracking something moving through the trees that only he could see. The walk back seemed to take much longer than it should have. The trails appeared different in the growing darkness, and more than once, Dad had to consult his compass to confirm we were heading in the right direction. The temperature continued to drop, and an odd mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around our ankles like ghostly fingers. Wesley remained silent except for occasional mumbling under his breath. When I managed to catch fragments of what he was saying, it made no sense. Numbers and words in sequences that had no apparent meaning, interspersed with phrases like the long neck and the watching ones. That night, Mom cleaned the mud off Wesley, while Dad called the local hospital for advice. The mud had an odd oily quality to it, and a strange smell that none of us could quite identify. It reminded me vaguely of rot and copper and something else, something that made my nose burn and my eyes water. Wesley didn't resist being cleaned up, but he didn't help either. He just sat there, passive, occasionally tracking invisible movements with his eyes. When Mom asked him questions about what happened, he would only repeat, "I never left," in that same flat tone. He didn't eat dinner that night. When Dad insisted he try, Wesley simply stared at his plate and whispered, "The food is wrong now. Everything is wrong now." Over the next few weeks, Wesley slowly began to act more like himself, but there were subtle differences that only someone who knew him well would notice. His handwriting changed, became more angular, with strange flourishes that didn't seem entirely human. He stopped keeping his notebook, saying only that they didn't want him to write anymore. He developed new habits. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., he would wake up and stand at his window, staring out into the darkness. When I asked him what he was looking at, he would say, "They're waiting. They're always waiting now." His drawings in art class at school changed too. His teacher called Mom, concerned about the recurring images he was producing. Tall, impossibly thin figures with elongated necks, standing among trees, always watching, always waiting. 5 years have passed since that day in the woods. Wesley is 16 now, the same age I was when it happened. On the surface, he seems normal. He gets good grades, has friends, plays on the basketball team. But there are moments when the mask slips, and I catch glimpses of whatever came back, wearing my brother's face. Sometimes, late at night, I hear him talking in his room. The voice that responds isn't his, and it doesn't sound human. The words are in no language I've ever heard, but they make my teeth ache and my vision blur. Dad sold his rifles and never went hunting again. The forest behind our house remains, but none of us go near it anymore. Sometimes, when I look out my window at night, I see shapes moving between the trees, tall, impossibly thin shapes with necks that bend in ways they shouldn't. Wesley says he never left us that day in the woods. Maybe he's right. Maybe whatever walked out of those trees with us was always there, waiting, watching. Maybe the brother I knew never really came back at all. I've never told this story before, partly because I'm afraid people won't believe me, but mostly because I'm afraid they will. Because if they believe me, they might start noticing things too. The way the shadows move when they shouldn't. The shapes that stand just at the edge of vision. The voices that speak in languages that human tongues were never meant to form. Once you start seeing these things, you can never stop. And they know when you've noticed them. They always know. Wesley told me something last night, something that made my blood run cold. He said, "They're spreading, you know. More of them every day. More of us every day." I don't know what he meant by us. I'm afraid I'll find out soon enough.